Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. Today, the never-ending death of Meredith Kercher. Don't know why death's never ending, Danny, but I guess we're going to find out because if you're new here, that's the format of the show. Danny has written it for me, I'm going to read it and comment as I see fit, so let's jump in. It is a sad reality that the murderer is usually guaranteed a far bigger place in the history books than the victims. Whilst names such as Charles Manson, Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer get their own books, documentaries, movies, TV dramatizations, collectible trading cards and posable action figures, the names of any of their victims don't roll off the tongue so easily. I think with Charles Manson though, the Manson murders probably do, although now I can't name them. Polanski's pregnant wife. Oh, that's terrible. I'm just proving Daddy's point, aren't I? The case of the 2007 murder of a young British student living in shared accommodation in the Italian city of Perugia is a particularly strange one, as the person who generated the most publicity out of it was neither the victim nor the only individual to have served a full prison term for the murder. Oh, this is, it's not it's not a spoiler alert, I don't really know much about this, but this is the one where, isn't it the person who's falsely accused or something speaks about this a lot? Have I got that right? We're about to find out over the next very many pages, because this is a long episode. In fact, the sole victim is probably pushed down to at least 5th place in the list of people who are the most likely to get discussed and remembered in this deeply unusual story. The names above her include an American and an Italian student, a man originally from the Ivory Coast, and a public prosecutor who was fixated on the idea that every criminal case he came across must have something to do with satanic rituals, including this one. Okay. You should put the bias, the preconceptions aside, my dude. Because also satanic rituals. Actually, I was going to say that's not real, but Satan and whatever you're doing the satanic rituals to are not real. But satanic rituals are totally real because that's a physical thing that happens. Anyway, head and shoulders above everyone else is a person who some would say has managed to carve a lucrative and high-profile career out of not being the victim or murderer, including a very recent step into stand-up comedy. Okay. Alarming police tactics, bungled investigations, and the peculiarities. There we go.
No extra points for good spelling.
Of Italian law all contributed to dragging this case on for over a decade. And it was often difficult to keep up with who was supposed to be innocent and who was supposed to be guilty. Brilliant. You know what that means. I'm probably not going to be able to keep up either, Danny. I hope you make it easy for me, mate. And while some are of the opinion that the matter has finally been settled once and for all, there are many who feel that justice has not fully been served and that there are still several questions left dangling in what might prove to be a never-ending saga. All right, then. I mean, it's definitely going to end in about 40 pages for us today, but let's see. Once upon a time in Perugia. Life had been pretty uneventful at the 2-story cottage on the outskirts of Perugia in central Italy, when there were only 6 Italian students living there. You tend to see a lot of students in Perugia. Around a quarter of the city's population of 150,000 are students taking advantage of one of Italy's most prominent university hubs. The 6 Italian students living at 7 Via della Piroga didn't all share the same apartment. There were 4 young Italian guys living on the ground floor apartment, and 2 young Italian women living on the upper floor. This sounds like the basis for a sitcom. Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti were both law students who wouldn't be rattling around on their own for much longer on that upper floor, as they were soon joined by 2 new exchange students in September 2007. And the sitcom setup continues. Except this isn't a sitcom. They're all going to, someone's going to die. Just spoiler alert there.
Duh, I know.
I assume. Within the space of just 7 weeks, 7 Via della Pergola would become one of the most famous properties in Perugia, but for all the wrong reasons. The first to walk through the doors was 21-year-old Meredith Kercher from Colston in South London. Widely described as warm, loving, kind, and refreshingly sensible, Meredith wrote poetry and short stories and had a passion for ballet and gymnastics. We have a little something in common here, as Meredith was also taking karate lessons. I didn't know Daddy took karate lessons, but there we go. Definitely not me. I haven't had karate lessons. I had 2 separate phases of this myself in my younger years and managed to climb all the way to the dizzy heights of white belt before giving up. Wait, isn't white belt the most basic one, Danny? I guess that's the joke, but I'm pretty sure it's the most basic one. It is in judo. I know a little bit more about judo. Not that I've ever done judo. I just remember it being an option to do it at school. And I remember seeing different coloured belts. I might still fancy my chances in an international ballet competition, though. Meredith was the youngest of 4 children. Her parents split up when she was just 4 years old, after which the kids were largely raised by their mother, Arlene, although their journalist father, John, was still very much involved in their life and offered regular support. Even so, it sounds as if Meredith and her siblings enjoyed a fairly modest life. Their house in Causden is described as being a bit ramshackle and in need of attention, but was too expensive to afford. The kind of place where the cupboard door handles fall off whenever you're trying to make yourself a lemon curd sandwich. Danny, I have not thought about lemon curd in about 30 years. I quite enjoy lemon curd with some biscuits. It's a weird thing. Now I really want some lemon curd. Yeah, and also, I'm not surprised that your house needs attention that was too expensive because you've got 4 kids. Although they said the father was doing support. So, okay, fine. But still, 4 kids is a lot of kids. Meredith did all right for herself, though, as she landed herself a scholarship at Old Palace School in Croydon, a posh private school which would normally have cost £10,000 a year to attend. And she fully deserved it. She was bright, studious, fluent in many languages, and harboured an ambition to become either a journalist or take on some kind of role working for the European Union. At the age of 18, Meredith moved up north to begin a 4-year European Studies degree at the University of Leeds, focusing on European politics and Italian. During this time, she supported herself by working as a barmaid and a tour guide, and at one point she even had a quite significant presence in the 2004 music video for Some Say by the British recording artist Christian Leontio. I have never heard of that song or that band, but I suppose it's something. 2004. It's like 20-something. No, never mind. Let's just move on. No, I'd never heard of him either. Okay, good. Danny knows more about culture than I do, and so that's good. Not too surprising, though, as he didn't hang around long after scoring a couple of minor hits, and Some Say wasn't one of them. In many ways, he's probably best remembered for having Meredith Kercher appear in one of his videos. It was about halfway through her degree in 2007 that Meredith jumped at the opportunity to spend a year in Italy as part of an exchange program. That would make sense if you are literally studying European politics and Italian, right? I kind of feel like a year abroad in said country would be kind of a part of the deal. She had first visited the country during a school trip and then made a return visit when she was 15 to spend the summer with an Italian family in the region of Campania. She had fallen in love with the culture of Italy and was thrilled by the idea of spending a whole year there. Meredith had specifically chosen to study at the Foreigners' University in Perugia because she considered the city to be particularly student-friendly and safe. The Foreigners' University is really weird. I guess it sounds better in Italian, but it vaguely sounds kind of discriminatory. Unfortunately, she may not have picked an ideal spot at 7 Via della Pergola, which was considered by many to be in a bit of a rough neighborhood, with drug dealers hanging around the parking areas and basketball courts. I mean, yeah, but you're a student, right? You probably don't, when I was a student, I didn't live in the best parts of town. Because you just don't. The cottage did come with some stunning views, though. And whilst Meredith Kercher is not likely to have been too interested in anything that the drug dealers were peddling, the next new resident to move into the upper floor apartment of the cottage, just 10 days after Meredith had unpacked her bags, might have been a bit more appreciative. She was the 20-year-old American student Amanda Knox from West Seattle, who was moving from the University of Washington to spend a year studying Italian language at the same university as Meredith. This, again, if someone wasn't going to die, this sounds like a sitcom. Amanda had a more comfortable upbringing than Meredith, although again her parents split up when she was a kid, and both remarried, with everyone remaining on good terms. She also enjoyed time in Italy as a child, and was excited as Meredith to enjoy a longer stay in the country, although both her father and stepfather expressed reservations about the idea. Well, yeah, Italy's a lot further away from America, especially West Coast America. As her father Kurt put it, one of the things we talked about with Amanda before she even went to Italy was what happens if something goes wrong. Your parents are now 6,000 miles away from you. What do you do? At that point, we were thinking about, medical. Well, you go to a hospital. It's like, I'm sure it's comforting to have your parents there and all of that stuff, but it's not like they're going to be doing the surgery or whatever you need themselves. On the face of it, you wouldn't really have expected Meredith and Amanda to have gotten on particularly well, as they were a bit like chalk and chutney. Amanda Knox was a party girl who could be a bit wild at times. She was very open about how much she enjoyed an active sex life. She regularly smoked weed. She is reported to have sometimes taken a casually dismissive attitude to matters that others might have viewed as quite important, such as, say, paying the rent on time. Yeah, that is pretty important. Although some people are really casual about that. Like, oh yeah, no, my rent is due, but especially when I was younger, but I really wanted to go out and have some fun with my mates. And it's like, what are you going to do about the rent this year? I don't know, I'll figure it out. Whereas I'm like, I've always been, well, if the rent's due, that's money that I just can't touch because it is for rent. But then again, I'm very boring. Meredith Kercher was quite the opposite. I'm the Meredith Kercher of this story. She was a lot more reserved, responsible, straight-laced, and possibly even a little shy and naive. She may well have occasionally taken a drag on a joint that was being passed around the room. It'd be rude not to, but she was certainly not as heavily into it as Amanda. But it sounds as if the pair of newcomers hit it off surprisingly well, at least to begin with. In fact, everybody seemed to get on pretty well with the new living arrangements at the cottage. The four women on the upper floor may have been aware that they were living in a lovely property in a slightly ropey area, but they were said to have felt protected to some degree by the four Italian guys downstairs, with whom they would regularly hang out. Meredith even started dating one of them, a guy called Giacomo, who felt the relationship became serious very quickly. Amanda had also hooked up with a new Italian bloke, a 23-year-old software engineering student named Raphael Solicito, whom she first met during a classical music concert that she attended with Meredith. He was described as a fairly shy Harry Potter lookalike, although I can't see much of a resemblance aside from the fact that he also wore glasses. Yes, but if you have a specific attribute, like people who are like, look, it's Simon! Just because I'm bald and have glasses and a beard, every person who's bald and has glasses and a beard apparently looks like me. I think there's one photo that has been sent to me over all of the years where I was like, wait, that's not me. There was one where it was like, that's a pretty good doppelganger, to be honest. But that's it. One out of thousands. Raphael was also likely to have got booted out of Hogwarts pretty quickly, as he wasn't averse to getting stoned out of his head every night, often with Amanda, who now spent most nights around his apartment, about 5 minutes away from the shared cottage. Amanda Knox had also picked up a job working at a relatively new bar in central Perugia called Le Chic, owned by a Congolese Frenchman named Dia Lumumba, more commonly known as Patrick. Amanda waited on tables, served behind the bar, and handed out flyers on the streets, although it's rumoured that Patrick was not entirely happy with his new employee. He may have been better off hiring Meredith. By the middle of October, there was a new face spotted in the cottage. He was an Ivory Coast native called Rudy Guede, who had lived in Italy since he was a kid. The Italian guys on the basement floor had met him whilst playing basketball, and we already know the kind of stuff that goes down on those basketball courts. Do we? Okay. It was alleged that Grady was a dealer who was supplying some of the Italian men with weed. It turns out that they were actually growing their own plants in their apartment, but we can only assume that they hadn't yet harvested any crop from them, otherwise they wouldn't have needed to go out and pretend to play basketball. Oh, okay, so wait, people just go to play basketball just to score weed? Is this like a thing that goes on? I didn't know that. Now when I see people playing basketball, all I'll be thinking about is they're actually just there to score weed. It was alleged that Grady had taken something of a fancy to Meredith, but she was already in a developing relationship with Giacomo and is not likely to have appreciated any advances from the local drug dealer. It's believed that she only actually met him once around this time, whereas Amanda bumped into him a couple of times over the next few weeks. Meanwhile, there were rumours that Meredith and Amanda's unlikely friendship was already beginning to grow a little tense toward the end of October. It might not have been entirely plain sailing from the beginning. Before Amanda hooked up with the Italian Harry Potter, she had a tendency to bring back men to the apartment late at night who were still hanging around the next morning. Meredith was said to be growing a little bit annoyed by the number of times she'd wander into the kitchen in the morning to be confronted by a half-naked stranger asking where the Marmite was kept. Yeah, that would get pretty annoying. You'd be like, come on. It would be like inviting your mates round and not asking your roommate. You ask your roommate. As time passed, it was also alleged that the pair ended up quarrelling about Amanda not pulling her weight with the chores, the mess she made in the house, and her excessive weed consumption. Meredith was also said to have felt uncomfortable with how Amanda insisted on keeping a small pink bunny-shaped vibrator on proud display within a transparent wash bag in the shared bathroom. This is a bit weird, isn't it? Like, why put it out on display? What's the message here? Yet it could have been that these were just the kind of perfectly natural arrangements that you're bound to experience when you're sharing a house with fellow students. And they were still happy to socialize with each other, albeit this became a bit less frequent when Amanda began spending much of her time at Raphael's apartment. All in all, it felt like both of them had settled quite nicely into their new lives in Perugia and enjoyed the company of a wide circle of friends. But a discovery in a garden villa in early November was to change everything. Just for once, we're not talking about a dead body or dismembered remains or anything of that nature. Not yet. We're just talking about a discarded mobile phone. Well, it was in fact 2 discarded mobile phones found in the same garden, one of which was registered to Filomena Romanelli, one of the 2 Italian women who shared the upper floor apartment. Now, this being the casual criminalist, it's perhaps no surprise that something far more horrific was found later that same day. On the morning of the 2nd of November 2007, a woman named Elizabeth Biscarini found a mobile phone in the back garden of her villa, which was about a 15-minute walk away from the shared student house. That is very odd. Like, why would that be there? The previous evening, Elizabeth had endured a pretty annoying time when she received a prank call from some dickhead who claimed to have planted a bomb in her toilet. What? She had to call in the postal police, or Polizia Postale e delle Comunicazioni. Thanks, Danny. Appreciate that, mate. To check it out. This is a specialized branch of one of Italy's national police forces dedicated to the investigation of digital, postal, and communication-related crimes. It sounds as if nothing much has come of this, as it was just a one-off prank call. When Elizabeth found the phone in her garden the next morning, she assumed at first that one of the officers must have dropped it while stomping around in the grass late at night. But when the postal police turned up again, they found the phone was registered to Filomena Romanelli. Another phone was found an hour later in the same garden, and this belonged to another resident of 7 Via della Pergola. When the postal service arrived at the shared student house, they found Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Raphael Solicito, who were both a little puzzled over how the police had arrived so quickly. The pair had just been on the brink of making an urgent call to the proper military police, or the Carabinieri, if we're being thoroughly authentic. Again, thank you. I feel like Carabinieri. Carabinieri. And it appeared at first that they'd arrived before the call had even been made, which would have been a pretty impressive service. They got those precogs. There had been a pretty good reason as to why they'd intended to phone the Carabinieri. Knox and Solicito were becoming increasingly concerned about the whereabouts of Meredith Kercher, although they also had an idea of exactly where she might be. Cartwheels and confessions. Things had been unusually quiet at the cottage on the previous day, as most of the residents were away to celebrate All Saints' Day, a public holiday in Italy. The 4 Italian men in the basement floor were all out of town and weren't expected back that night. The 2 Italian women on the upper floor were also out of town, whilst Amanda Knox claimed to have spent the whole night at her boyfriend's apartment. Meredith, I feel like I do know the name Amanda Knox, so she's the one who's farming some fame off this, right? Because that name does feel familiar to me. Meredith had spent the day enjoying dinner and watching a movie with a few of her British friends before heading back home to an entirely empty property at around 8:45 p.m. She had phoned her mum in the daytime and explained that although she was still feeling a bit groggy from a Halloween party she had attended the previous night, she intended to write an essay when she got back home. The following morning, Knox phoned Meredith and was surprised that the call wasn't answered. According to Knox, she left her boyfriend's apartment later in the morning and returned home for a while. There was no sign of Meredith, but the bedroom door was locked, so Knox assumed that she was sleeping. Knox took a shower in the bathroom that she shared with Meredith. It was only when she stepped out of the shower that she noticed drops of blood on the bath mat on the floor, although again, she didn't appear to worry too much about this. She figured that Meredith, who was quite obsessive about hygiene and cleanliness, may have left some menstrual blood on the floor and hadn't got around to cleaning it up yet. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, like, a spot of blood somewhere is not, like, that shocking. I'll sometimes have a spot of blood in the sink, shaving my head, and you're like, god damn it. And then you get a little blood, and it's a little bit of blood. It is what it is. She also found something else unusual in the other bathroom shared by the 2 Italian law students. A giant turd floating in the toilet. Again, I'll be like, God, Christ, come on, guys. But I wouldn't think much more than that. I would probably flush it and then step away quickly. Shrugging her shoulders, Knox then gave her mum a quick telephone call before heading back to Solicito's apartment. They both returned to the cottage just before midday, and it was Solicito who was the first to become concerned that something may have happened last night. He checked out the rooms and noticed that a window in Filomena Romanelli's bedroom had been shattered, suggesting to him that someone may have broken in, although at first glance, nothing of value appeared to have been taken. But this is the thing, it's a broken window, and then there's a spot of blood, and there's a giant turd. I don't think you'd necessarily assume the worst. You'd just be like, oh, Jesus, how'd that window get broken? And then you've already written off the blood. The only room he couldn't check was Meredith's bedroom, as it was still locked, and nothing appeared to be stirring inside when they banged on the door and called out. And she still wasn't answering her phone. Oh, I get why they have a feeling they know where she is, because she could be in the bedroom, because the door's locked from the inside, right? Solicito even attempted to barge down the door at one point, but the fairly skinny and light student only managed to hurt himself and put a big dent in the door. Knox phoned Filomena, to tell her that somebody may have broken in through the window and that there was no sign of Meredith. Philomena was attending a crafts festival, but agreed to get back home as soon as possible with a couple of male friends in tow. Good plan. This is all excellent. Solicito then called his older sister, who was a lieutenant in the Carabinieri, and she advised him to call the emergency number to get the Carabinieri on the scene. Okay. This is all being handled extremely sensibly. Almost immediately after this advice had been given, the postal police arrived on the scene with news about a pair of mobile phones found in a villa garden. Solicito told the postal police that something of a more pressing nature might need attention here, as it looked like there had been a break-in, there was blood on the floor of the bathroom, and he couldn't get inside Meredith's bedroom. I get the feeling, can't the postal police or the Carabinieri knock down that door real promptish? They got big boots, big lads, go on. After the Carabinieri were called, Philomena arrived with her male friends and was able to shed more light on the mobile phones found in the garden. Although the SIM card in one of the phones was registered to herself, both of the phones actually belonged to Meredith Kercher. Meredith had a UK phone, which she used to call her family and friends back home. But Philomena had also lent her an Italian SIM card to put in another phone so that she could make cheaper local calls without having to mess about setting up a new contract. It's 2007, can you just on pay as you go? It's so much easier these days. We're just in Europe and it's like, a friend of mine is a Spanish dude who lives here. He's lived here for years. He still has a Spanish number because he's like, it's the same. Philomena also confirmed that nothing appeared to have been taken from her bedroom or the rest of the apartment, but she made a bit of a mess while she was rummaging around in a flustered state, which wasn't going to help in preserving a crime scene if indeed a crime had taken place. The housemates asked the postal police if they wouldn't mind battering down the door to Meredith's bedroom to check if she was okay. Quite surprisingly, they refused point blank. The official line was they didn't think that the circumstances warranted the damaging of private property. It could have just been that they felt it wasn't their place to get involved, as none of this appeared to have anything to do with digital postal or communication-related crime. No, I imagine they're like, this doesn't warrant this, which isn't crazy unreasonable. I'd say it's, probably you should, but especially if you're like, I will pay for it. Please just break down the door. It's my responsibility. I'll lose my deposit, but go on, mate. Give it a welly. So, Philomena's friends took it upon themselves to kick in the door. Good stuff. Presumably, being a bit stronger than Solicito, it didn't take them long. But nobody was prepared for what they found on the other side. The body of Meredith Kercher was on the floor, covered by a duvet. She was entirely naked aside from a t-shirt pulled up to her neck. Her bra had been cut off her body and discarded at her feet. She was covered in cuts and bruises, and there was a deep gash across her throat. Jesus. There were bloodstains on the sink tap, and a single bloody footprint on the floor. Later on in the investigation, it was also established that the imprint of a large knife could be seen on one of the bedsheets, whilst a bloodied handprint was also found on a pillow that had been placed under Meredith's hips. The autopsy estimated Meredith Kercher's time of death to be around 11:30 p.m., over 2.5 hours after it was believed that she had returned home. The coroner found 16 bruises and 7 cuts across her body, as well as bruising to her genitals. The injuries indicated that the attacker had been attempting to subdue the victim during a violent sexual assault. The inquest later concluded that she died from hemorrhagic shock after the cut to her neck led to severe blood loss. Over 300 people attended Meredith's funeral at Croydon Minster, which was followed by a private burial. One of the first detectives on the scene was Marco Chiacchiera, who was quick to ascertain that the signs of a break-in had been staged, as Philomena's bedroom window had clearly been broken from the inside. This is a dumbass mistake. This led to the logical conclusion that Meredith must have voluntarily let the killer in, or the killer already had a key. They certainly didn't break in through a first-floor window, even if that's how the scene was designed to appear. Amanda Knox was the only other resident of the cottage to have been in town that night, even though she claimed to have stopped at Solicito's apartment. She told detectives that she'd actually meant to have been working a shift at Le Chic that evening, but she had received a text message from the owner, Patrick Lumumba, who told her that she wasn't needed as the place wasn't particularly busy. So instead she spent the night with Solicito, smoking lots of weed and watching films. She also felt it important to point out that they had engaged in lots of sex. Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate the details. Her story was backed up entirely by Solicito. He's like, yeah, we did. But there appeared to be a few minor discrepancies in their story. For example, Knox claimed that when she came across the giant turd in the toilet, she flushed it away. But it was still very much there when the detectives arrived at the house. I mean, that's okay. It's a floater. It's a giant float, which might be why it was there in the first place. Maybe it was just particularly tenacious and resistant to multiple flushes. Exactly. Come to think of it, it's weird that nobody else flushed the toilet before the arrival of the Carabinieri. I mean, maybe they did, they tried. It just didn't work. On a slightly shadier note, both of them claimed to have phoned the Carabinieri before the arrival of the postal police. They even made the point that they initially thought the postal police were the Carabinieri responding to their call. Very quick.
That's what she said.
However, the logged calls to emergency services showed that Solicito had only made the call after the postal police showed up, leading detectives to question why they hadn't raised the alarm much earlier. Were they only spurred into action when it looked as if the police were already on the case? That is a weird discrepancy. Especially because they know that phone logs will be checked. It's a fucking murder. They later claimed that they were in an understandable state of confusion and horror at the time, and may have got some of the details wrong. It does sound as if they were on the brink of making an emergency call, as the phone logs showed that Solicito had called his sister in the Carabinieri before the postal police arrived. Yeah, I do think that this could just be a genuine misunderstanding or like a misstatement or something like that, even a misremembering. Maybe she thought, yeah, I did call the police. Oh, no, I called my lieutenant's sister first. No, I'm sorry. I feel like, and also what you just saw is pretty intense. You're going to be shaken up. Knox claims that she hadn't contacted the police much earlier, say when she was in the apartment earlier that morning and noticed spots of blood on the bathroom floor, because she hadn't yet grasped the seriousness of the situation. Completely fine. I agree. I also wouldn't have called the police at that. The pair stuck with the same story for the next few days, but there was to be a major shift a few days later, on the evening of November 5th, which would lead directly to 3 arrests. It all started on a fairly low-key note. Rafael Solicito had been called to the police station to clarify a few quibbles in his statements. Amanda Knox offered to accompany him, and she waited in the corridor whilst he was being interviewed. The police are like, and just how much sex did you have in the night? Just like, plenty, officer. We have plenty.
Lots and lots of sex.
She was probably more than a little concerned when a police officer eventually approached her and told her that a significant change in her boyfriend's statement meant that they now had to speak with her again urgently. Oh no, he's like, we didn't have any sex. Solicito was now telling police that he couldn't be 100% certain if Knox had stayed with him at the apartment for the whole night because he was too stoned out of his mind to remember. Bro, how stoned were you? Good God. I mean, I've been pretty stoned, but I would remember the details of someone's presence. And this kind of ruins Knox's night, as she now had to spend the rest of it facing increasingly intense questioning, which led to a very surprising outcome by the early hours of the next morning. Amanda Knox signed a statement in which she admitted that she'd been present when her friend was murdered, and that she knew the identity of the killer. What? It was the owner of Le Chic and her current boss, Patrick Lumumba. That came out of left field. Okay, he's literally been mentioned twice so far. Details of the statement are sparse, and Knox claimed that her memory was a bit fuzzy after smoking too many joints with Solicito. But she reckons she left his apartment alone at around 8:30 p.m. and met up with Patrick. They both went back to the cottage, where Patrick seemed to hit it off with Meredith, who had just got back from meeting her friends. Why did she meet up with Patrick? Isn't she... That's her current boss. She's meeting up with him at 8:30 at night. She wasn't supposed to go to work, but what is going on? And why are they going back to her apartment? Is she having an affair with the boss? And then Patrick hits it off with her mate. Okay. Knox claims that the pair were having sex in Meredith's bedroom while she was busy in the kitchen. She then covered her ears in fright because she could hear heavy thuds and screaming coming from the bedroom. That's all we really know about the statement. Still, it sounds as if we now have this case completely wrapped up. Patrick Lumumba was the killer. He did seem like an odd name to pull out of the hat, though. Yeah, bloody hell, like I said, left field or what? The 38-year-old family man had been regarded as a well-liked and upstanding member of the community for years and had no previous criminal record whatsoever. Even Amanda Knox was quick to dismiss her own story. By the following afternoon, she'd been allowed to compose a separate handwritten 4-page memo, which was later printed in the press. This had apparently been an attempt to gather her own thoughts and process what had just happened, although she seems as confused as ever by the end of it. Did she even meet up? It seems extremely unlikely that she randomly meets up with her boss. They go back to her apartment. Her boss has sex and murders her mate. I don't think he was even there. This seems extremely made up. There are quite a few intriguing thoughts that she jots down in this meandering memo. She says she was told by the police that hard evidence placed her at the scene of the murder, even though she finds this impossible to believe. She recalls dreamlike sequences in her mind of seeing Patrick at the basketball courts and of hearing Meredith's screams, and ponders if her dreams are real. She recalls that during the night of the murder, when she was at Solicito's apartment, she saw that her boyfriend had blood on his hands at around 11 p.m., which she assumed was from the fish he'd just been cooking. Honestly, it sounds like you have done something a bit stronger than weed, my dude.
What are you smoking?
And she wonders why Solicito had suddenly started lying in his statements when he knew full well that she'd spent all night with him. She asks herself, what does he have to hide? I don't think he killed Meredith, but I do think he is scared, like me, and perhaps he is trying to find a way out by disassociating himself with me. But then there's one of the most important segments of the memo. In regard to this confession that I made last night, I want to make it clear that I'm very doubtful of the verity of my statements because they were made under the pressures of stress, shock, and extreme exhaustion. Not only was I told I would be arrested and put in jail for 30 years, but I was also hit in the head when I didn't remember a fact correctly. It was under this pressure and many hours of confusion that my mind came up with these answers. Their version of reality was taking over. I felt confused, frantic, and there was no escape. Oh my god, you've got to stop smoking weed. Holy shit. The detectives did appear to get pretty heavy on Knox during the questioning. It sounds as if they deployed the Reed technique, a controversial method devised by polygraph expert John E. Reed in the 1950s, which involves creating a high-stress environment, making shit up, pretending to have proof of guilt, and then turning all nice and sympathetic by reassuring the suspect that they can be helped if they tell the police exactly what they want to hear. Some say it's quite an effective method, whilst critics point out that a minor flaw with the Reed technique is that it can also break down entirely innocent people who become convinced that making an entirely false confession is their only way out. Yeah, I've done a whole video on the Reed technique. I think it was on Into the Shadows, and it is effective. But it's like torture. Yeah, it's effective, but it also gets people to admit to shit that they didn't do because they're being tortured. There are certain elements of the interrogation which often tend to get wildly exaggerated, and Knox herself is sometimes guilty of helping to push a distorted version of what really went down. Many media reports claim that the initial interrogation dragged on for over 50 grueling hours, during which time she was denied a lawyer, wasn't given food, water, or an opportunity to visit the bathroom, and was struck across the head by one of the detectives. Look, if that is true, that is outrageous. I think you should absolutely have an amount of time limited for how long you can interrogate someone. That would be crazy. And also not giving them food and water for 50 hours. That's over 2 days. It's true that she faced further questioning staggered over the next few days, but it certainly wasn't one continuous long slog, and the original interview leading directly to the so-called confession statement lasted just 90 minutes. Well, it sounds like Amanda's still making some shit up, right? Allegedly. She maybe wasn't treated to a slap-up meal and a bottle of wine during that initial interrogation, but she was given food and drink over the next few days, and the idea of not allowing her to go to the toilet for 50 hours wouldn't have been a good idea for anybody in that interview room. I don't know what the laws are in Italy, but really not having a lawyer, not being allowed a lawyer, seems like a very serious thing. I'm pretty sure most countries are like, yes, you are allowed legal representation. The blow to the head, which Knox often referenced, was downgraded by herself years later to a slap. It doesn't matter, it still shouldn't be happening. Whilst detectives clearly have no business slapping suspects around the head, the original implication was that Knox received quite a heavy strike, whereas it now sounds as if it was less than a quarter as powerful as the kind of slap Will Smith might dash out on stage in front of an audience of hundreds of millions. Oh, Will Smith, what happens?
Oh, wow! Keep my wife's name out your mouth!
It's still not acceptable if it happens, which the Italian authorities deny, but I'm not sure if they make allowances for that kind of thing in the Reed Technique handbook. Knox wouldn't... I'm pretty sure they don't. Knox wouldn't have been entitled to a lawyer during the initial interview, as she wasn't under arrest and had attended the police station voluntarily. Ooh, wasn't entitled to a lawyer, but could have a lawyer? I would definitely want a lawyer, even if I'm there voluntarily. But she was certainly entitled to a lawyer when she officially became a suspect, and it took a ridiculously long time for her to be given one, around 5 days. Well, as long as nothing is happening during those 5 days, that's fine. I mean, there are a limited supply of lawyers. Whilst the police deny that Knox was treated badly and insisted the interrogation was firm but polite, things may have been more transparent if they'd actually bothered to record the interview, which they didn't. This was a major blunder on their part. And it's also a little weird how the name Patrick Lumumba entered the conversation. According to Knox, she was asked if she replied to the text message that he had sent her that night telling her not to come into work. She replied that she hadn't. The detectives went through her phone and uncovered that she had. That I would absolutely put down to just the smoking of the pipe. Like, you could easily forget that. The other she forgot? you gotta be out of your gourd, man. The incoming message from Patrick had been deleted, as Knox explained that she routinely deleted incoming messages to save space on her phone. Slightly, oddly, she had not deleted her final message from Meredith. Yeah, I don't think that's that odd. I do remember, phones around this time. What was this, 2007? It was so you could store 100 text messages. You're like, okay, I gotta delete some text messages before I can get a new one. What the fuck? I know it's storage limitations or whatever. But oh my god, have we come a long way in 20 years, haven't we? But the detectives found her reply to Patrick, which was just a simple message along the lines of, okay, see you later, good night. It's not unreasonable to think that Knox may have forgotten that she replied to Patrick and forgotten to delete the final message from Meredith. Nope. I am in the Knox, there's something up here, definitely camp, but that's completely reasonable. But the detectives appeared to pounce on this as something meaningful and maybe read too much into the reply to Patrick. Oh, they're going to be like, see you later, as in see you at the basketball courts later for a little bit of murder. Whereas I think she just means see you later, not literally, but as in see you later for my next shift. They seem to think that see you later may have literally meant see you tonight, and this appeared to prompt them into pressurizing Knox to spill the beans on Patrick to save her own skin, a potential example of the Reed technique gone wrong. This does sound like an example of the Reed technique gone wrong. So it sounds as if the interviews weren't exactly handled particularly well, to put it mildly, although it could also be said that Knox's peculiar behavior during the whole ordeal wasn't exactly helping matters. During the earlier interviews down at the police station, shortly after Meredith's body was found, most of Meredith's friends were understandably in a state of shock and distress as they sat in the waiting area. But they weren't very impressed with Knox, who didn't seem quite as bothered as the rest of them. She spent the whole time kissing and petting Rafael Solicito, and at one point was admonished by a police officer for sitting in his lap. Solicito later implied that this was largely her fault, as she had wrapped herself around him like a koala bear. This is some really odd behavior. But odd behavior does not make a murderer. A few days later, when Knox was sitting in the corridor waiting patiently for her boyfriend to drop her in the she allegedly alleviated the boredom by going through a few stretching exercises, doing the splits, and performing a cartwheel. Again, bizarre behavior, but again, not indicative of her being a murderer. She's received a lot of flack for this, as it doesn't seem like an entirely appropriate way to conduct yourself when you're sat in a police station shortly after your friend has been murdered. If there'd been more people waiting in the corridor, she might have been tempted to try and get a conga going. But it may not be an entirely fair accusation. Housemate Philomena Romanelli confirmed that Knox had a natural habit of bursting into spontaneous stretching exercises when she was feeling a bit stiff. Knox claimed that a police officer observed this and remarked upon her impressive flexibility before asking what else she could do, prompting Knox to do the splits just once. And somehow, we've arrived back into sitcom territory. She denied ever performing a cartwheel, although multiple police officers insisted that she did. It was also later exposed that on the very same night Meredith's body was discovered, Knox had jotted down a few private thoughts in a notebook, which was later confiscated by the police. Uh-oh, what are you writing down? Don't be writing down things. One curious segment in her notebook reads, "So, I'm at the police station after a long day, in which I describe how I was the first person to arrive home and find my flatmate dead. The strange thing is, after all that happens, I want to write a song about all this. It would be the first song I've written, and would speak about how someone died in a horrible way, and for no reason. How morbid is all that? Laura and Philomena are really upset. I'm dying of hunger. I really want to say that I could murder a pizza, but that doesn't seem right." Okay, so this is weird. Her whole behavior's weird, but it's also stinks of her being like an edgelord, right? She's just being edgy on purpose. And yeah, it's cringe. But again, I don't think it makes her a murderer. Some of this behavior might seem a little odd, and Knox has been criticized for not seeming to take the murder of her friend very seriously. She admits herself that she could have been more sensitive, but I'm not sure any of it necessarily points to an increased likelihood of guilt. If anything, it might point more in the opposite direction, as unless she was a raging psychopath, you'd expect a guilty party to try and behave in a more traditional manner instead of just doing what came naturally. Yeah, I think so. It's true that Knox was eccentric, to put it politely. She perhaps lacked a bit of empathy and ability to read the room and handled challenging situations quite differently than most of us, but there was no evidence yet to suggest that she was a killer. Yeah, I think Danny and I are on pretty much the same page here. She is a weird one, but no, nothing to suggest she murdered anybody yet. The police were more concerned about other elements of the couple's behavior around the time of the murder, and shortly afterwards. The musings in her notebook conveyed how she was the first person to arrive home and find my flatmate dead. Two things that are true. She was the first person home, and she did find her flatmate dead. It sounds, the way she's written it, like she went home and then found the flatmate. But that could also be interpreted as she went home first and then found the flatmate with everyone else. When the Carabinieri first arrived at the cottage, she'd told them that she'd found the body herself and even described the position in which it was found. Okay. The problem here is that according to everyone else in the house at the time, she never actually saw the body. She had been in another room when the bedroom door was barged down, and she did not go into the bedroom afterwards. So how did she know? Solicito also told the postal police that nothing had been taken from Filomena's bedroom. Yet this was before Filomena had arrived and had a good look around to confirm it. How could Solicito have been so sure that nothing had been taken from the bedroom of a woman that he didn't even know particularly well? That is a lot more unusual, even than... I don't know why, but that smells way more off to me than her being like, and then I found the body. Because she seems to be this, like, attention person. Like, she just wants to be in it. And this is not serving her well in a murder investigation. But she does feel like that person. And another thing, on the night of the murder, both Knox and Solicito switched off their mobile phones at around 8:40 p.m, just a few hours after Meredith's estimated time of death, and left them off until the next morning. Now, there's nothing too suspicious about that in itself. They may have just fancied watching films and enjoying a good night together without interruption. I do this myself all the time, as I don't want any phone making constant pinging noises while I'm trying to enjoy Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. Knox claimed that she specifically turned off her phone because she didn't want to be pestered about work, which was not the most convincing argument, as she'd already been told by Patrick that she wasn't needed that night. It could be. Did phones back in the day tell you whether a message was delivered or not? I don't think so, right? It was just sent and then out in the ether and hopefully they read it. But she could have totally turned it off with the idea that if the bar got busier, Patrick would be like, "Yo, Amanda, come on down to the bar, I need you." But if the phone's off, he doesn't get even a ring, so he knows it's off. And then she could give she has reasonable reason to be like, I had my phone off, rather than I was ignoring your calls because I know you wanted me to come to work. I suppose she could have been worried that he might change his mind and call her in if the bar got busy. Exactly. But the thing that raises an eyebrow here is that switching their phones off so early and leaving them off for so long was entirely out of character for both of them. Their phone records showed that they usually switched them off much later at night before retiring to bed, and there were no previous occasions of such prolonged inactivity. Interesting. Could this have been a synchronized effort to avoid creating a trail of location data on the night that Meredith was murdered? Maybe. That is really suspicious, although if it was me, I would leave my phone on and at home, and then I'd go out murdering. Because they'd be like, "Oh, I was home the whole time. Check my phone records." I mean, it's a weak alibi, but it's something. Something else turned up a little later, on November the 15th, which might have been a little bit more tangible than the breaking of habits, dodgy memories, and performing cartwheels down at the police station. Detectives came across a kitchen knife in Solito's apartment, which was sent to the forensic unit for testing. The detective who found it claimed that it only caught his attention because it was on top of a pile in a drawer. The forensic unit declared that the knife had been vigorously scrubbed, which only proves that Solicito made a good job of washing up after himself. A full, clear profile of Amanda Knox's DNA was found on the handle, which is no great revelation as she spent a lot of time at the apartment and is likely to have used the knife herself. Yes, but then, if it was scrubbed so clean, why is there still DNA on the handle? It's like she just scrubbed the murdery bit. But then again, if you're cleaning a knife, just washing it up, you wouldn't really focus on the handle, would you? You'd focus on the blade. But more alarmingly, a low-level partial profile of Meredith Kercher's DNA was found on the blade. Holy sh... That is a way bigger thing. Around 7 weeks later, Meredith's bra clasp was found back in the cottage. It's a puzzle why it took so long to locate the bra clasp, which could potentially be a crucial piece of evidence. And it seems that it was crucial. The bra clasp was said to contain traces of Solicito's DNA. I told you something smelled wrong about that. I told you, as soon as he said, "No, nothing's been nicked," it's like, how do you know? How do you know? And you don't seem, like, eccentric. You just seem normal. How do you know? And now look at this. Amanda Knox, Raphael Solicito, and Patrick Lumumba had all been arrested on suspicion of involvement in Meredith's murder by November the 6th. But let's get Patrick out of the way right now. The poor guy spent 2 weeks in prison before he was eventually released when it was confirmed that he'd spent the whole night in question working at his bar, a fact which was backed up by the dozens of customers that he was serving. Why in 2 weeks in prison? Just because some person said that in a haze? Like the fuck? Yeah, no, maybe it was a dream. Let's put him in prison for 2 weeks just in case. The fuck, but the Italian police, come on. Not sure why it took so long to get that sorted, but it was now clear that Knox's original confession statement was hardly reliable. Patrick could potentially have stayed behind bars for even longer if fresh evidence from the cottage hadn't emerged on November the 19th. A fourth arrest was now imminent. The forensic unit had found a match for the bloodied handprint that was found on a pillow in Meredith's bedroom. It belonged to Rudy Gator, the Ivory Coast native, who was believed to be supplying the Italian guys on the basement floor with weed. Wait, I mean, the Solicito thingy, the DNA on the knife and on the bra clasp? That seems pretty... Ooh, what if he was having an affair with Meredith, and that's how his DNA got on the bra clasp? His DNA was on the handle of the knife because it's his knife, and then someone else used the knife. Wait, from his apartment? How did Rudy get the knife from his apartment then? Oh gosh, this is a confusing one. The only trouble was that it buggered off to Germany shortly after the murder. Interesting. Foxy Noxy, the diabolical she-devil. 20-year-old Rudy Gator lived in the Ivory Coast until the age of 5 when he moved to Bruges with his father in around 1992. By all accounts, he was a bit of a handful, regularly skipping school and preferring to stay indoors playing video games. Yeah, I mean, we all prefer to stay indoors playing video games, dude, but you gotta go to school. When he hit 17, his disinterested dad moved back to the Ivory Coast without him and left his son homeless. Jesus Christ. What a dick. Until a wealthy family offered to take him in and put him on the right path. What a nice gesture. Despite their commendable intentions, it sadly didn't work out, and they turfed him out onto the streets in 2007. The adoptive father later lamented, "Rudy was a disappointment. I hoped to help him build a future. I thought I'd given him an opportunity. But as the months passed, I understood I was mistaken, that my hopes were all met with delusion. He had little wish to study, and even less to work." Grade A moved into a modest apartment, and whilst it's not entirely clear how he supported himself, he was dealing drugs. It may have had something to do with the time he spent at the basketball courts not playing basketball with the likes of the Italian students from the basement floor of the cottage, indeed. None of them could remember exactly when they first met Grade A, but they did recall the first time they'd invited him back round to their apartment. Either drunk or high or both, he visited the bathroom, but then didn't come out again for ages. They eventually braved it and went in there to find him fast asleep on the toilet that had not been flushed. Wait, did Rudy lay the giant log that was just... What the fuck, Rudy? What sort of behavior is that? You get invited around to someone's house, you hang it out, and then you take a giant and fall asleep on the toilet. Just 5 days before Meredith was murdered, he was caught breaking into the office of the headmistress of a local kindergarten, armed with an 11-inch knife, which he claimed he needed for protection. Dude, you're the one doing the breaking in, what the fuck? Those kindergarten headmistresses can be notoriously brutal if you get on the wrong side of them. He reckons that he just needed somewhere to kip for the night, despite the fact that his apartment was just around the corner. What is wrong with you, dude? You were there stealing shit or something. Though why you'd break into a kindergarten to steal shit is a mystery beyond me. His backpack was found to contain items which had been stolen from a lawyer's office just a few days earlier. Now, breaking into the lawyer's office, that seems to make a lot more sense to me. Grade A was fingerprinted and released pending further proceedings. Wait, you found his bloody handprint in the bedroom, and he gets released pending further proceedings, and the dude who was like in a weed fever dream gets 2 weeks in prison waiting for him to be cleared at the bar where there were dozens of witnesses. Oh, or was this before they identified the fingerprint? Maybe that's it. He didn't flee to... Sorry, yeah, that's probably it, right? Because they're taking his fingerprints and then they're going to find the bloody print later and it's going to be his. Okay, sorry, that makes more sense. He didn't flee to Germany immediately after Meredith was murdered. That very same night, he went out nightclubbing with a friend and stayed out until 4:30 a.m. He also went out to the nightclub the next night. It wasn't until the following morning, the day after Meredith's body was discovered, that he headed off to Germany, where he spent a few days sleeping rough in empty train carriages. Coincidentally, it was a trip on a train that tripped him up and led the German police right to his carriage. He'd been caught travelling without a ticket, and in a desperate bid to get out of trouble with the fierce-looking conductor, he blurted out that he was having a bit of a bad time in general because he was on the run and wanted for murder. Bro, what are you doing? Classic schoolboy error. Never admit to burning down a monastery when you're being questioned over stealing a Curly Whirly. Indeed. Curly Whirly is a type of chocolate bar. Americans, just in case you don't have Curly Whirlies. Grade A spent a few weeks in German prison before his extradition back to Italy, where he faced charges of murder, aggravated sexual assault, and theft, whilst Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito faced charges including murder, carrying a weapon, and simulating a burglary. Knox also faced a separate charge of criminal slander relating to the false allegations made against Patrick Lumumba. Yeah, good. I think there should be consequences for that. All three were held in prison until their respective trials. Can you imagine if they go to trial and two of them get found guilty of murder? And it's like, yeah, no, the case is really convincing. It's like, well, we know one of them didn't do it. God. At this point, we should pause for a second to consider some of the oddities of Italian law. Innocent until proven guilty might be a sensible way of assessing the status of a defendant, but Italy takes that a few steps further with the notion that you're still innocent even when you're proven guilty, for a long while at least. Yes, because of appeals in Italy, right? You're innocent until all appeals have been exhausted. You're not technically convicted until you've exhausted the long-winded appeals process, although you can still be held in prison while awaiting the definitive verdict. They really take their time about this as well. There are often long gaps in between hearings, so a typical trial could be staggered out for months or even years, meaning that a defendant, who is technically still innocent, ends up languishing in prison for an incredibly long time, a point which hasn't gone down very well with the European Court of Human Rights. No, that doesn't seem like the best way to handle things. Although, yeah, that just doesn't seem very well done, to be honest. In much the same way as a few other European countries, Italy also gives the defendants the option to plump for a fast-track trial rather than a full one. Okay. What, do you just have to pay extra, a little bit like at the airport, to go through fast-track security? In a fast-track trial, you don't get much in the way of a jury, witnesses, new evidence, cross-examination, or reporters. Instead, a judge makes the decision behind closed doors based entirely on the existing investigation file. That sounds a little bit rushed. I suppose that's one way of speeding things up a bit, and there's a juicy incentive for choosing fast track. You'll automatically get a third of your sentence knocked off if you're found guilty. And that's not a bad deal, really, is it? So if you think a guilty verdict is pretty likely in your case, a fast track trial is probably the way to go. Knox and Solicito opted to go for the full works and would be tried together in a high-profile courtroom drama which spanned 11 months, with hearings usually held twice a week for 3 weeks a month. That's actually not too drawn out for an Italian trial. Grado went for the fast track. His official reasoning was that the other two had formed a pact against him and wanted a separate hearing. There was no testimony from Rudy Grady during his closed trial, which kicked off on the 6th of November 2008. The statements he had given earlier to the police explained how he had bumped into Meredith Kercher at a Halloween party on the night before she was murdered. He reckons they'd been flirting with each other all night and arranged to meet up at the cottage the following evening as it would be empty. It's true that Meredith had attended the same Halloween party dressed as a vampire, but none of her friends ever recalled her seeing her with Grady. Not even Grady's own friends could recall seeing her with him, and they said that he spent most of the night talking to a different young woman that looked nothing like Meredith, and notably was not dressed as a vampire. Grady claimed that he turned up at the cottage at around 9 p.m, and the pair started making out, although he insisted they didn't have sex, as neither of them had a condom. Meredith's friends found this scenario highly implausible, as she was besotted with her new boyfriend, Giacomo, and was unlikely to have cheated on him with the guy who struggled with the concept of flushing a toilet. Speaking of which, Grady stated that he quickly began to develop stomach pains, which he put down to a dodgy kebab he'd eaten earlier, prompting him to dash over to the toilet in the bathroom shared by the two Italian students. So he does at least seem to be taking ownership of the mess that was found in the toilet. Yes, indeed. Whilst he was in the bathroom, he claimed to have heard Meredith screaming. He emerged from the bathroom to find a shadowy figure standing over her body whilst holding a knife. Guido reckoned that the guy clocked him and triumphantly said aloud, "Found black man, found culprit, let's go," before fleeing the apartments. He claimed to have briefly tried to help Meredith, but then ran away and left her to die, as he feared to be wrongly blamed for her murder because he was black. He said that he now regretted not being a man and staying with Meredith. I do not find this particularly plausible. It's worth remembering that he wasn't in that much of a rush to get out of Italy, as he found the time to head off to the nightclub later that evening, and the following night too. The investigation files contained more than enough evidence to suggest that Guido might not have been telling the whole truth. The whole murder scene was crawling with his DNA, which might not be deemed too suspicious, as he never denied spending time in the bedroom. But his bloodied shoe prints were found over the floor, which doesn't quite tally with the idea of offering brief assistance before legging it. His bloodied handprint was found underneath the mostly naked body, which he couldn't explain, as he claims that Meredith had been fully dressed when he left her. None of his DNA could be detected on either the two mobile phones that were later dumped in the villa garden, but it was found, along with more of Meredith's blood, in her shoulder bag, from which the items were believed to have been stolen after she was murdered. This is all... I mean... I think he might have done this. And despite his own claims that they never had intercourse, a vaginal swab taken from Meredith revealed yet more of his DNA. What? I mean, come on. There's no other way that this is going down other than you're getting sentenced for murder. It wasn't all bad news for Guido, though, as Judge Michelli acquitted him on the charges of theft. Oh, I mean, dude's going to prison for a long-ass time. Don't know if that matters. But he was found guilty of the sexual assault and murder of Meredith Kercher and sentenced to 30 years in prison, cut down to 20 years with his fast-track bonus reduction. So it sounds as if we now have this case completely wrapped up once and for all. Rudy Gady was the killer, but this story still has a long way to run. Yeah, I mean, the only reason that I'm doubting this right now is because we are not even halfway through this episode. It's interesting that Gady had at no point implicated either Knox or Solicito in the murder, at least not yet. But Judge Michelli clearly thought that they were involved. He didn't believe that Gady was wielding the knife that killed Meredith, as he felt that the evidence pointed to Gady having two specific accomplices. All right, then. Whereas Gady's trial had been a pretty quiet affair, the trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito was generating a trail of publicity long before it even began, although nearly all of the attention was on Knox, which I'm sure she loved. The American media was convinced that she was innocent and expressed concern that she was unlikely to get a fair trial in Italy, whereas the Italian media tended to portray her as a sex-mad drug addict criminal who should never have been allowed to step foot in the country. I mean, she smokes too much pot. And being sex mad is not a crime. I don't think that's a reason to deny her a visa. The press went digging through her history and latched onto the fact that her old nickname had been Foxy Noxy, a name that she appeared to like as she used it for her own MySpace account. This helped to spur headlines along the lines of "The Dark Angel of Seattle. Kercher claimed Amanda was a drugged-up tart. I'm only a target because I'm sexy, and Foxy Noxy had to compete with her own mother for men." The fuck sort of headlines are these? Is this like... oh my god, this is some tabloid shit right there. The nickname may actually have had quite innocent origins, as Knox and her family have all suggested that it was actually a reference to her speed and agility on the school soccer pitch. Yeah, maybe. Maybe it also had a double meaning. Her own private journals revealed that she had enjoyed sex with 7 men in the first 6 weeks of moving to Italy, and that she had once had sex with a complete stranger on a train and ended up catching oral herpes. Another incident from her recent past was also dragged up, in which she had been fined for a disturbance and noise violation after hosting a wild party back in Seattle. Okay, so she's a party girl. That's not a crime. Witnesses reported that her friends had been hurling rocks into the road and causing passenger cars to swerve to avoid them. Well, that is most definitely a crime, whilst what was going on inside was even worse. I bet they were playing their music a bit too loud as well. Rafael Solicito's history was also investigated by the press, although on nowhere near the same scale. Perhaps that partly because his history just wasn't quite as titillating. He enjoyed smoking weed and watching pornography. He owned a collection of swords and knives. He once posted a selfie on social media in which he was cheerfully posing with a meat cleaver and a jug of cleaning fluid. He once wrote on his blog that he craved new sensations. Again, this is just... it could just be the profile of an edgelord. Like... yeah, it's just people who haven't quite stopped being teenagers yet. And get this, he also enjoyed reading manga graphic novels and vampire comics. Case closed, my lords. Okay, yeah, it's just not that interesting. He's just a guy. But it was Knox that came under the heaviest fire by far, and the Italian press pushed forward with the idea that her colourful history suggested that the murder must have taken place during some kind of drug-crazed sex game orchestrated by Knox in which Meredith had refused to participate. Does seem a bit of a stretch, doesn't it? But you gotta sell those papers, right? Of course, it's more than a bit of a leap to suggest that an active sex life, a wild party, and recreational drug use is proof that Knox must have been capable of murdering her friends. None of it seems remotely relevant to the case. No, but like I say, it's gonna sell some papers, isn't it? Yet the prosecution seemed to adopt a similar stance. Well, not at first. The initial theory was that Meredith had been murdered during a satanic ritual. Oh, I forgot about this, and the cop who's really into this stuff. Or like into seeing this stuff in things that he's... Or is it the prosecutor? Oh yeah, the prosecutor. Giuliano Mignini, who had a bit of a history in this devilish department. A few years earlier, he'd reopened certain elements of the investigation into the infamous Monster of Florence case, in which 8 double murders had taken place between 1968 and 1985. Mignini's bizarre theory was that some of the murders had been commissioned by a satanic sect who were paying a bunch of farmers to steal the female genitalia that was required for their rituals. He even suggested that some of the most powerful people in the country were involved in covering up the conspiracy. Bro, I think you've been smoking some of Amanda's weed. He was talking out of his arse, though, as his mad idea flew against all the available evidence, which strongly indicated a single killer. In fact, he was under scrutiny himself during the trial of Knox and Solicito, as he was facing 4 counts of abuse of office during his pursuit of the satanic sect, including the illegal wiretapping of journalists and police officers. What are you doing? How are you still a lawyer? You should be, allegedly, in my opinion, disbarred. McNeely was actually found guilty of, so I don't have to say allegedly, guilty of those 4 charges in 2010, but don't forget that we're talking about Italy, and so he was still technically innocent. He was later acquitted in 2017 after a disciplinary court found that there had been no wrongdoing in his conduct. Bro, in my opinion, allegedly, yeah, there was. Dude. But Mignini had reached similar batty conclusions when he first began tackling this case, and he believed that Meredith had been murdered during a satanic ritual or a Halloween sacrifice. How exactly he had reached the conclusion is a little fuzzy. The timing of the murder, an upturned chair found at the scene, and the unflushed toilets were all apparently clues. It's still not screaming out satanic ritual to me, but I'm not an expert like Mignini. Thankfully, though, somebody on the prosecution team put a word in his ear and convinced him that it might be a good plan to drop the whole devil-worshipping angle and focus instead on, the murder being rooted in an argument which erupted into a group assault. Yeah, maybe that would be a good idea. How are you still a lawyer, in my opinion? When the trial got underway, at the Court d'Assizes of Perugia on the 16th of January 2009, by which time Knox and Solicito had been incarcerated for over 14 months, Mignini illustrated his theory to the court with the help of a creepy 23-minute computer-generated film which depicted blocky 3D avatars of the cast of real-life characters. Things really are done differently in Italy. Yeah, and this was 2009? 2009? Yeah, these graphics going to be bad. And there was a little controversy over whether it really had been worth spending a reported 200,000 euros of public money on the production of an animation of a theory. How? What? How? Oh my god, if I was Italian taxpayer, I'd be like, what the fuck? Mignini talked about the 8-member panel of 2 professional judges and 6 lay judges, ordinary members of the community, selected to sit alongside the pros through his cartoon version of the events that night. Ordinary members of the public. That sounds kind of like a jury. Without... Okay. He suggested that Knox, Solicito, and Guide had been out drinking heavily together and returned to the cottage late at night to find Meredith, who had been happily studying alone and now wasn't very impressed that a housemate had returned with 2 drunk blokes. A fierce argument erupted between the 2 women over their clash in lifestyles, which ended with Knox attacking Meredith in her own bedroom. Mignini reckons that Knox came out with a not entirely convincing line of dialogue, quote, "You acted the goody-goody so much, now we're going to show you. Now you're going to be forced to have sex." Right. You just making shit up or what? How do you possibly know what she said? Why are you speculating like this? There's not even a jury. You're just talking to a judge. It's like that scene in Catch Me If You Can where he's pretending to be a lawyer and he's like, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," and the judge is like, "This is pre-trial. There is no jury."
Mr. Connors, this is a preliminary hearing. There is no defendant.
Knox repeatedly banged Meredith's head against the wall, then Solicito and Guide joined in the attack and assisted Knox in undressing the victim. Guide then sexually assaulted Meredith before Knox got a hold of a kitchen knife and delivered the fatal cut to the neck. All 3 fled the cottage, but Knox and Solicito returned very early the next morning to stage a burglary and do a quick cleanup. They smashed Philomena's bedroom window from the inside, not very clever, and took items from Meredith's shoulder bag, including the 2 mobile phones which were lobbed into the garden of a villa 15 minutes away. The call that was made to Meredith later that morning was just to ascertain whether the phones had been found yet. Of course, most of this was little more than speculation, and quite flawed speculation in some ways. Yes, like pretending that you know what was being said. What is happening, Italian courts? That last point about Knox and Solicito stealing the phones was a particularly odd accusation to make, as only Guide's DNA was ever found in the shoulder bag. The prosecution later wheeled out a few supposed witnesses, although none of them seemed particularly credible or useful. A neighbor across the street heard a scream from the cottage at some point between 11 p.m. and 11:30, followed by the sound of footsteps on the driveway, but didn't bother to investigate. A local shopkeeper claimed to have recalled seeing Knox hovering around the cleaning products aisle of his store on the morning after the murder, but couldn't recall if she actually bought anything. This is ridiculous. A homeless guy claimed to have seen Knox, Solicito, and Guide hanging around together in a bar shortly before the murder, but his testimony was dismissed when it was revealed that he was a heroin addict. A taxi driver recalled a hostile encounter with Knox and Solicito on that night when he nearly ran them over because they were huddled together in the middle of the road. He got into an argument with Solicito and ended up punching him, at which point Knox pulled out a large knife on him. The taxi driver felt confident that it was Knox because he recognized the distinctive gap between her front teeth. A slight niggle there is that Knox doesn't have a gap between her front teeth. What? What are these witnesses? What's going on?
I don't know what the hell is going on with you people, but all of you need to leave.
One piece of evidence that wasn't admissible in court was the original confession statement from Knox that implicated Patrick Lumumba. It was on the ground the police protocol hadn't been followed, the interview was not recorded, a lawyer had not been present, and Knox had been in a state of confused duress when signing the statements. Yeah, I think that's completely fine. I think that is how it went down. It's fucking bizarre, but that's how it went down. Controversially, the inadmissible statement would still prove to have a role to play in the courtroom. Okay, well, that's not very good if it was inadmissible. In the meantime, the prosecution was pushing forward the idea that Rudy Guede couldn't have acted alone, a point which had been emphasized earlier by Judge Micheli during Guide's trial. Meredith's body had been covered in cuts and bruises. With a background in karate, it's assumed that she would have put up a strong fight against her attacker. So, it might seem unlikely that one person could have inflicted so much relentless damage without getting hurt a little themselves, yet Guide only had a relatively small cut on his hand when he was picked up in Germany. The DNA evidence seemed to suggest that the accomplices must have been Knox and Solicito. It's not too surprising that their DNA was all over the apartment, as Knox lived there, and Solicito was a regular visitor. Yeah. I think we could just discount that immediately. Of more concern was the traces of Solicito's DNA found on Meredith's bra clasp, and the trace of Meredith's DNA found on the blade of a kitchen knife in his apartment, which also had Knox's DNA all over the handle. Yeah, that is the DNA on the blade of the kitchen knife in his apartment is really weird. The DNA on the bra clasp is like, yeah, maybe, but wait, I wrote this off earlier and I don't quite remember why. It was no DNA of his all over the handle. But it could have come off and she could have been using it later. It could have gone in the dishwasher or something in between. I'm coming around to being a bit more suspicious about that. I don't remember why I wrote it off so easily earlier. Solicito's defense team pointed out that none of his DNA was found anywhere else on the bra, whereas Guide's DNA had been all over it. They pondered how anyone could touch a tiny clasp without touching the rest of the cloth. Well, I'll tell you, because he was touching the clasp to take the bra off. And then when the bra was off, he didn't need to touch the bra anymore. Allegedly. It's interesting. As for the knife, Solicito himself claimed that he may have once accidentally pricked Meredith with it whilst he was cooking, which doesn't sound entirely convincing. No, it doesn't, does it? It's like, well, I was chopping and I accidentally cut her. What? Perhaps a more important point here is that the kitchen knife didn't match the imprint of the knife that was found on Meredith's bedsheet. Oh. Requests made by the defense team for an independent review of the DNA evidence were rejected. Whoa, why? Oh my god, that seems like obviously should be done, because this is really confusing DNA evidence. The defense teams for both also questioned why Meredith's bedroom wasn't plastered with forensic evidence connected to their clients, such as DNA traces, fingerprints, shoe prints, etc., in contrast to the overwhelming traces left behind by Guide. When the prosecution suggested that Knox and Solicito had performed a cleanup operation the following morning, the defense quite reasonably pointed out that they did an extraordinary job of selectively removing their own traces while leaving behind everything related to Guide. Yeah, prosecution, you are not doing a very good job here, to be honest. It seems a little distasteful that when it was time for Amanda Knox to take the stand, one of the very first questions thrown in her direction was why she kept a small pink bunny-shaped vibrator on display in the shared bathroom. How the fuck is that relevant? Is this an attempt at comedy, this trial? The topic quickly came up when she was being questioned about her relationship with Meredith and whether it had turned sour over matters such as this. Knox insisted that their relationship had still been in a healthy shape and that the particularly small vibrator had just been a joke gift from a friend which he had on display for a laugh. Yeah, I think that's entirely reasonable. The point about the state of the friendship wasn't backed up by everyone. Some of Meredith's British friends testified that Meredith was far from happy with Knox bringing back different men every night, while housemate Philomena appeared to acknowledge a rift, saying they had no reason not to get along, but it seemed that as time went on, they drifted apart. Well, it sounds like they've got several reasons not to get along. She seems a bit slobby at also bringing men back to the house you hang about. Even so, the frequent text messages getting pinged back and forth between the two were always very friendly, and they show that Knox and Meredith were making social plans together in the days leading right up to the murder. Yeah, it doesn't seem like they're just friends. They're not close friends, they're not best friends, they're just mates. Knox's behaviour again courted controversy in the courtroom. The fact that she wore a colourful Beatles t-shirt emblazoned with the words, "All you need is love," didn't go down well in some quarters and would probably have resulted in a ticking off from Judge Judy if it had happened in her courtroom. To be fair, she wore it on Valentine's Day. Doesn't matter, you shouldn't wear that to court, wear something fucking smart. She could be quite sarcastic during questioning. When it was put to her that she murdered Meredith, she sniffily replied, "Yes, I did then, but I don't remember." Risky business right there. She often appeared to be posing for the cameras during her journey in and out of the courtroom and seemed more concerned about her appearance than the murder charge she was facing. And she frequently appeared a bit too cheerful in the courtroom. She was once caught passing chocolates to Solicito, and she was broadly smiling in many of the photographs that were taken by the media. At least one of these occasions was when she spotted her family in the courtroom, but there were plenty of others too. Something that doesn't get mentioned quite so often, though, is that there were plenty of other photographs taken during the trial in which she was clearly horrified and upset. But even so, her slightly eccentric behaviour probably wasn't endearing her to the court. No, she's a really unusual person. But that doesn't mean she's a murderer. I don't know. Solicito, I don't know, man. Gride, I think he's in prison. Solicito, I'm suspicious about. Knox, I'm kind of like, you're just a weird person.
You're really weird.
As the trial neared its climax, Knox would probably not have felt the inclination to smile quite so much when she first heard details that were emerging in a separate case being held on different days in the very same courtroom. This was Rudy Gade's appeal against his conviction, and it appeared that he had changed his tune over some parts of his story, spawning the slightly ill-conceived headline from CBS, "Convicted Killer Fingers Knox for Meredith Kercher's Murder." Yes, Aguirre made a spontaneous statement in which he now placed Amanda Knox in the cottage on the night of the murder. He said that an argument had broken out between Meredith and Knox after Meredith found that some money was missing from her drawer. Aguirre excused himself and went to the bathroom. We all know the story of what happened in there, and whilst he was in there, he heard the ring of the doorbell and a male voice. He never directly named Solicito as the visitor, but that appeared to be the implication. Shortly afterwards, Aguirre says that he heard a scream. When he came out of the bathroom, Meredith was bleeding to death on the floor, whilst he heard hurried footsteps outside fading into the distance. When he looked out of the window, he saw the silhouette of Knox. This version of events was disputed by a few of Guido's inmates, who would later testify in court that he had privately confessed that neither Knox nor Solicito were present on the night of the murder. An Italian bricklayer named Mario Alessi stated that Guido confessed that he and an unnamed friend had both gone to the cottage with Meredith under the hope that they would both have sex with her. When Meredith refused the invitation, his friend grew angry and pulled out a knife, leading to a tussle in which Meredith's throat was cut. Two other inmates also claimed to have overheard this story. This is what happened, isn't it? But then what's up with Solicito and the blood on the knife? It has to be said that Guido's new version of events didn't have much of an impact, as it appeared that he was just seizing the opportunity to cast more doubt on the other two whilst their trial was still ongoing. He could hardly be considered a reliable witness. His appeal didn't turn out too badly for him, and he ended up getting his base sentence reduced to 24 years, meaning that he now had to only serve 16 years with a fast-track reduction. Wow, okay, so that guy's now out of prison. That's pretty intense for an extremely violent murder. 16 years, I don't feel that's going to cut it. The factors that contributed to the decision included his young age and his lack of a previous criminal record, despite the fact that he was caught in the kindergarten office with a knife just a few days before the murder. Yeah, and he was nicking stuff from the lawyer's office, and he was dealing pot. Like, no criminal record? Okay. It does seem like a strangely lenient sentence for such a savage crime, doesn't it ever, Danny? Francesco Maresca, the lawyer representing the family of Meredith, expressed his disappointment at the drastic reduction and called for a moral reflection on whether such a short sentence was appropriate in this case. Yeah, agreed with you, mate. Absolutely. Meanwhile, the trial of Knox and Solicito reached a conclusion on the 5th of December 2009. Knox is innocent. She's not going anywhere, right? And Solicito, the blood on the knife is weird. I don't know what to make of that, but it's not enough. So he's also not guilty. Is my guess here. I don't know enough about this case. I do know that Knox is free now. I don't remember if she spent time. In their closing statements, the defense teams argued that there was no compelling evidence, no motive, and no reason to suggest that their clients would have murdered a friend. Solicito's lawyer went so far as to describe Knox as a weak and fragile girl who had been duped by the police. But none of this was going to cut the mustard. The pair were found guilty of murder, sexual violence, faking a break-in, and theft. Holy sh! What the fuck? There's no evidence other than the tiny knife thing. What the fuck, Italy? This is not okay. Solicito was sentenced to 25 years in prison while Knox was sentenced to 26. They were ordered to pay €5 million in damages to the Kercher family, although this was seen as largely symbolic with little chance of recovery. Meredith's father John later declared that he wouldn't accept a single cent from them, as nobody should profit from the murder. Well, just take the money and give it to charity, mate. Just do that. Give it to a charity that does something good. Knox was also found guilty of an entirely separate charge in a trial which was running concurrently with the main trial in the same courtroom. Patrick Lumumba had filed a lawsuit against her for falsely accusing him of murder in her statements to the police, and Knox was found guilty of slander. She received a 3-year prison sentence for this and was ordered to pay him €50,000, although Patrick barely saw any of this. Yeah, okay, that one I'm totally fine with. I mean, I know it was like a weird situation and everything, and the duress and all of this, but still, there should have been some sort of punishment for that. But the fact that she gets 3 years for that, and the dude got 16 years for that insanely brutal murder, that's fucking nuts. This charge was controversial in many ways, but one of the biggest problems with it was how it was handled. The original confession statement had not been deemed admissible evidence for the murder trial, yet it being heard by the exact same lay judges in the slander trial, leading to criticism that supposedly inadmissible evidence could have swayed the murder verdicts. Yeah. In fact, the whole case was considered more than controversial, in the US at least. Wow, this is super controversial. This should be regarded as super controversial. The Italian media generally supported the idea that the judges had made the right decision. But the US media was more of the opinion that an anti-Americanism angle had led to a gross miscarriage of justice. Knox's family released a statement in which they angrily declared that unwarranted and unfair pretrial attacks on Amanda's character had biased the judges and overshadowed the lack of evidence. Speaking of which, US forensic experts were highly critical of the small amount of evidence that was used in court, noting that the DNA testing was below the standards that would need to be met in a US trial, the request to independently validate the results was denied, and the Italian police couldn't replicate the results that they claimed to have found. Yeah, look, from my perspective, I'm not Italian, I'm not American either, but this seems insanely like something that should have been done. And I know I'm pretty happy to judge like other cultures and their legal systems. And this doesn't seem very good. Sorry, Italians. Even Donald Trump got involved, of course he did, declaring that Amanda Knox was totally innocent and that Americans should boycott Italy until she was freed. That could potentially have been a very long boycott, as Knox and Solicito were still in prison well over a year later when the appeal trial got underway. Amanda Knox had turned to Harry Potter for help during her time in Capan prison on the outskirts of Perugia. She worked her way through the Italian editions of every book in the Harry Potter series. Oh, okay. I thought it meant like who was the boyfriend? Was she the girl with the Harry Potter boyfriend? She worked her way through the Italian editions of every book in the Harry Potter series in a bid to become fluent in the language, and ended up becoming the prison's unofficial translator and scribe for international inmates. Raphael Solicito didn't seem to be enjoying himself quite so much, as he claims to have spent much of his time playing with cockroaches. That's very weird. He was placed in solitary confinement for 6 months and later assigned to a sex offender wing. While he believed that most people around him thought he was innocent, he feels that he was still treated particularly harshly as punishment for not turning on Knox. That sucks, because you're like, there's nothing to turn on if she's innocent, if he's innocent. But they were both about to bump into an old face during the appeal that kicked off in November 2010, but it was unlikely to be a happy reunion. By the way, I do find it interesting that Knox is reading Harry Potter and becoming a translator in prison. Like, she's a weird cookie, but she does seem to make the best out of every situation, doesn't she? Jesus. It's bizarre. She's wired very strange. A handcuffed Rudy Guede arrived in court primarily to deny the recent allegations made by his inmates that had privately confessed that neither of the defendants were guilty. He dismissed these allegations as lies and claimed that all he'd ever talked to his inmates about was soccer and cinema. He refused to answer any other questions relating to the night of the murder, although his earlier statement, which implicated the pair, was read out in court. A shocked Amanda Knox expressed our horror that Guede still couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. She told the court, "The only time that Rudy Guede, Raphael Solicito and I were in one room together was in a courtroom. He knows what the truth is. I don't know what happened that night." The rest of the appeal focused largely on the reliability of the DNA results found on the kitchen knife and the bra clasp. Forensic experts agreed that it was clear, and not very surprising, that Knox's DNA had been found on the handle. Yep, that's completely normal, but they were less convinced about the small trace of Meredith's DNA supposedly found on the blade. Why are we saying supposedly now? I thought that was a locked down fact. I think it should absolutely have been third-party tested. I think it's insane that it wasn't, given that that is essentially what is convicting two people of murder. But I thought it was likely, or at least pretty certain. It was a weak partial profile. Oh, we did say that, right? Which was so tiny that the blade couldn't be double tested. It was quite feasible that the blade could have been contaminated with a minuscule sample during the rather clumsy collection and analysis procedures, during which the packaging had not been sealed whilst it was in the same workspace as multiple other items containing the victim's DNA. Are you Italy? Are you crime lab? That's insane. That is insane. That is what essentially got these people convicted. The fingers on the bra clasp. I'm amazed that Solicito, I guess maybe he wasn't having an affair with her and the DNA got there some other way, but it does seem like that's how the DNA would get on the bra clasp, no? And a really important point to note here is that no trace of blood was ever found on the knife. Oh, so it's not even blood DNA, it's just DNA. Oh my. Whilst it was suggested that the knife had been rigorously cleaned, it seems incredibly unlikely that all traces of blood were removed whilst leaving behind such large samples of Amanda Knox's DNA. But it was a small sample, no? There were also issues with the bra clasp too. And to be fair, if this is how sloppy the DNA lab is, Jesus Christ, maybe you need to throw that out as well. This was only found a whole 47 days after the murder, during which time it had been inadvertently moved around the floor of the apartment where it collected dust. There were several other DNA profiles belonging to unknown males found on the bra clasp, and experts indicated that this was a blatantly obvious example of contamination due to prolonged exposure and movement. Yeah, isn't a lot of dust like our old bits of skin, which, have old bits of DNA in them? This line of thinking was rejected by the prosecution, who are now calling for the original prison sentences to be increased to life. Perhaps the most shocking words of all came from the lawyer of Patrick Lumumba, who was present as the charge of slander against Knox was also being appealed. Why appeal that? Okay, sure, appeal it because it's 3 years in jail. But, you did that shit. According to Patrick's lawyer, Amanda Knox was a demonic, satanic, diabolical she-devil, a spell-casting witch, and a virtuoso of deceit. Okay, what is up with Italy and this? She was also devoted to lust, drugs, and alcohol, and she was dirty on the inside in her soul and spirit. Pretty strong stuff, if a little more than over the top. Yeah, chill out, my dude. The good news for Patrick Lumumba is that Knox's slander conviction was upheld. But the good news for Knox and Solicito is that they were acquitted of all other charges on the 3rd of October 2011. As they should be. I can't believe they spent a year in prison on this weak-ass evidence. The appeal judges, again made up of 2 professionals and 6 lay judges, found that basic errors had been made during the original police investigation and that Knox's interrogation had been of an obsessive duration, which wasn't even admissible. Right? They also found any association with Rudy Gay to be far from probable, and that the original guilty verdicts had not been corroborated by any objective elements of evidence. Whilst Knox's 3-year prison sentence for slander still stood, this was deemed to have already been served, as the pair had now spent very close to 4 years in prison, or 1,427 days to be precise. Knox immediately returned back to Seattle when she was released. Yeah, as I would find, I'd never go back to Italy. There was a sense of celebration in the US, although this wasn't exactly shared over in the UK, where Meredith's family were trying to come to terms with the decision. The decision, but I don't think she did this. And I think the courts got it right the second time around. They released a statement which read, "We were satisfied with the original verdict. Nothing's changed. We respect the decision of the judges, but we do not understand how the decision of the first trial could be so radically overturned. We still trust the Italian judicial system and hope that the truth will eventually emerge." I'm sorry, I know you lost someone. And I know that, I can't know how fucking hard that can be. But the evidence is just not there. It's just not good enough. They were also critical of how Knox's family had orchestrated a full-scale PR campaign in a bid to gain sympathy for Amanda, which had shifted the focus away from the victim. Yeah, and again, I understand. I can't understand. It's enormously difficult. I can't put myself in that position. But their family, in their eyes, had an innocent person locked up in prison for 26 years. They're going to do whatever they fucking can. As Meredith's brother Lyle put it, it's very difficult to talk about forgiveness at this time, with the media hype around the case, and the defendant is involved in that. The brutality of it has been forgotten. Elsewhere in the UK, Channel 5's long-running morning chat show The Right Stuff took a staggeringly inappropriate approach to this latest development in the case of a 21-year-old British student's murder. One of the hot topics, debated on the following morning's edition of the show, went under the headline, Foxy Noxy, would ya? Oh my god, that is so incredibly distasteful. The host, Matthew Wright, observed that Foxy Noxy was reported to love wild sex, and he encouraged viewers to phone in and let him know whether you'd go back to her place if you got an invitation. That is so grim, my dude. Someone got murdered. Please tell me there was some consequence for this. Now, The Right Stuff was trash TV at the best of times, but this was distasteful even by its own low standards, prompting complaint about the crass sexism and the blatant disregard for the Kercher family. Yeah! Matthew Wright initially defended this segment, oh fuck off Matthew, claiming that it was topical and legitimate debate. Bro doesn't understand, f off, but he later issued a public apology and the episode was pulled from Channel 5's on-demand service. That should be the minimum that was done. Still, it sounds as if we now have the case completely wrapped up once and for all. Rudy Grado was the killer, whilst Knox and Solicito were completely innocent. There was still more to come though. Yeah, we've still got a bunch of pages to go. Like Danny said, it's the never-ending death. Good lord. A fistful of dollars. Both Knox and Solicito both had a very similar idea after they were released, and that was to make a few quid by writing books which conveyed their sides of the story. Knox was paid a reported $4 million advance by HarperCollins for a memoir, Waiting to be Heard, which was released in a blaze of massive publicity in 2015. If that figure is true, then HarperCollins would have lost a shitload of money, as whilst the book entered the New York Times bestseller list on the first week of release, it quickly sank like a stone, selling an estimated total of 36,000 copies in the US. Which I guess it seems like a lot of books, but I guess it's not a lot of books in the grand scheme. I mean, I'd be proud if I wrote a book that had made it onto the New York Times bestseller list for a week, but if I'd been advanced 4 million quid, then I suspect my publisher wouldn't have been in a rush to treat me to a celebratory dinner. The book itself is a fairly predictable account of how Knox feels she was badly treated by the press, the police, and the Italian courts. If her memoir was a flop, then Raphael Solicito's book, Honor Bound, My Journey to Hell and Back with Amanda Knox, was a complete non-starter, attracting almost zero publicity and hardly generating any sales. This is because, of course, nobody really cares about Solicito. He even had to put Knox's name in the title of his own book. And that's a shame because his book was probably a lot more revealing. He's critical of himself for getting so high on the night of the murder that he couldn't remember if Knox had stayed at his apartment. He recalls feeling uneasy when Knox was all over him whilst they were waiting at the police station in the presence of Meredith's other friends. But while Solicito insists that he didn't believe for a second that his then-girlfriend was capable of committing murder, he also admits to harboring confused thoughts at the time. He writes, if the problem was with Amanda and the things she might or might not have done outside the house, assuming she left at all, why not focus the investigation on her? Maybe she knew something. Maybe there was something she hadn't told me. But please, I thought, leave me out of it. Yeah, and if we're agreeing that the clasp and the ridiculous tiny DNA on the knife, this dude just had nothing to do with it. He probably just leave me the fuck alone. I don't blame him for writing a book about it because he's been in prison for 4 years and he wants to make a buck. It felt as if Solicito was beginning to distance himself, to a small degree, from Knox, a trend which would continue over the next few years. He later admitted that he had asked her a bunch of questions over her suspicious activity in the cottage on the morning following the murder. He asked her why on earth she hadn't phoned the police as soon as she spotted the blood on the bathroom floor, instead of just heading back to his place after a quick shower. He says he never got any satisfactory answers. He also made a quite reasonable point to CNN. I'm not saying that Amanda is responsible for all this situation, but they focus on her and they accuse her all the time. But I have nothing to do with all these circumstances and all these accusations. There is nothing against me and nothing very strong against Amanda. And in my case, I really did nothing wrong and I don't want to pay for someone else's peculiar behavior. Dude, I'm now that we've fairly comfortably written off the ridiculous knife evidence on the DNA evidence on the knife, I'm yeah, dude. Funnily enough, Knox didn't seem to mind this change in attitude as she responded, the only reason he'd been dragged into this is because he happens to be my alibi. But it still wasn't exactly a united front that battled the next stage of the saga, when the Supreme Court of Cassation announced in 2013 that it had granted the prosecution's request for a retrial in Florence. I don't know what Italy and America's relationships are like in this regard, but Amanda Knox, it seems that the Americans were very much on her side. Donald Trump was like, she's innocent. He's not president yet. It's been 4 years. Was he president? When was this happening? 2013. Oh no, way before Trump. But yeah, I imagine extradition requests would last until Trump, and then Trump would be like, no, you don't. Solicito attended the trial to give testimony, but Knox, perhaps quite sensibly, elected to stay put in Seattle, as she wasn't mad keen on the idea of being thrown straight in the slammer again if the earlier appeal was overturned. During his testimony, Solicito told the Florence court, "I would like to make you understand that these charges against me are absurd. There was not a basis to charge me to put me in jail. I ask you to look at reality." That might have been a bit of a big ask, as the retrial is possibly one of the most confusing and illogical phases of the whole story. Oh my god, if they find him guilty, I'm going to lose my shit. Only one piece of new evidence was presented, and this was a fresh DNA sample taken from the blade of the kitchen knife. The results showed absolutely no trace of Meredith's DNA. So why the fuck you ask for a retrial, prosecution? What the fuck are you playing at? So you might think that the defendants didn't have too much to worry about here, but you'll be wrong. The acquittal was overturned, which meant that Knox and Solicito were once again guilty of murder. Well, they were still technically innocent until their next appeal, but let's not get too bogged down with that again. The point is that it wasn't a good result for the pair. And this retrial had never really been in the business of pursuing new evidence or weighing up the guilt and innocence of the defendants. It was more about highlighting procedural issues that were deemed to have taken place during the previous appeal and acquittal. For example, the Florence court ruled that not enough attention had been paid to the evidence in Rudy Gade's trial, which indicated that more than one person must have been involved in the attack. More attention should have been spent on Knox's confession statement, the changing of statements, the fact that Solicito backed away from being an alibi, the suspicious out-of-character phone activity, and the witness statements, such as the one from the homeless heroin addict, which had been discounted without sufficient reasoning. In conclusion, it was ruled that the appeals court had failed to give enough weight to the circumstantial evidence in context. Oh dear. So this wasn't a case of the Florence court issuing new guilty verdicts. It was more a case of reverting back to the earlier verdicts, now that the acquittals had been annulled. Knox did, however, get an extra 2.5 years slapped onto her sentence due to a recalculation, which added the charge for slander back onto the total. Whether she would actually be sent back to prison at all is a different story. Solicito was of course still in Italy, and could have been sent back to prison at any time, but he was allowed to remain at liberty, albeit limited liberty after surrendering his passport, until the final appeal to the Supreme Court. Knox had no intention of voluntarily returning to Italy, declaring that she would prefer to become a fugitive instead of accepting extradition. It's not crystal clear how a request for extradition would have panned out anyway. American lawyers make the slightly baffling point that the Florence trial was a violation of the double jeopardy principle, which states that an individual can't be tried again for the same crime after they've been acquitted. Which is fine, but Italy doesn't follow the same strict double jeopardy code, at least not until the appeals process has been entirely exhausted. Yeah, but I'm not an expert on extradition laws, which is to say I don't know anything about them at all, but the American courts get to decide she'll appeal extradition. So she'll say, I don't want to be extradited, even though there's an extradition treaty, here are my reasons, and that will be heard. And this could be one part of an argument, that she's not going to get a fair trial by American standards abroad, which I think is pretty legit. Yet, as there was still a strong sense in the US that Knox had not been treated fairly in the Italian courts, there was possibly a strong chance that the request for extradition would have been denied. But this is all academic for now, as the final appeal at the Supreme Court of Cassation in Rome would reach a conclusion on the 27th of March, and this time the decision would be final. A proper final verdict with no more trials, no more appeals, no backseas, and no more pissing about. And the final verdict? Amanda Knox and Raphael Solicito were innocent of all charges related to the murder of Meredith Kercher. Danny, why do we still have 15 pages left? What is going to happen now? The court could simply have concluded that there wasn't sufficient evidence for a conviction, but it made the clear point that the defendants were innocent in a case without foundation and ordered that there should be no further trial. The judges ruled that there had been sensational failures in the police investigation, which had resulted in a rush to judgment in the face of intense scrutiny from the press. The Florence court was also criticized for culpable omissions, which concluded completely ignoring expert testimony that indicated a likely contamination of evidence. The Supreme Court concluded that Knox and Solicito could not have participated in the murder, as not one shred of evidence proved that Knox and Solicito were at the crime scene, and no biological traces of them were found in the bedroom or on Meredith's body, in sharp contrast to Rudy Gade, who had practically decorated the place with his forensic signature. It didn't all go entirely Knox's way. The conviction of slander against Patrick Lumumba was upheld, although she was again deemed to have already served her time. Knox wasn't happy about the outstanding conviction, and this was one chapter which would rumble on for a while longer yet. But in the meantime, she expressed her relief at finally being definitively cleared of murder, noting in a statement, "The knowledge of my innocence has given me strength in the darkest times of this ordeal." Rafael Solicito was probably even more relieved, as he would have been thrown straight back into an Italian prison if the final verdict had been guilty. His lawyer declared outside the court in Rome, "This is truly a very important day. Not just, I believe, for Rafael Solicito, but I believe also for all of those who believe strongly in justice." Yep, agreed. The one guy who didn't agree was Patrick Lumumba. He later told The Observer, "This is not good for justice. I think it shows the power available for rich people. She's American and rich. For a country like Italy, this is not good. I think there were diplomatic problems with the US, and it makes things difficult with the US, so they let her free. Amanda is free because she is American, but Americans are human like everybody. What Amanda did I don't know, but I think she knows why Meredith died." Look, Patrick, I think it was very unfortunate that you were wrapped up in this in any way whatsoever, and I think it's nonsense, and the slander thing is absolutely bang on, and she got what I would say is a very harsh prison sentence of 3 years for that, plus a substantial fine. Justice was served for you, mate. Now, off. In my opinion. The Kercher family have sadly never believed that everyone involved in the murder of Meredith has been held to account. In a rare moment of public frustration, Sister Stephanie later complained in 2022, "I swear I do not understand why the case cannot be reopened. Rudy Gade did not act alone. If he is responsible in conjunction with others, why not look for those others? I feel disappointed with Italian justice. Time does not lessen the pain, and I remain dissatisfied." I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier about my feelings on the family's response to this, but they remain. Amanda Knox would score another minor victory a few years later when the European Court of Human Rights ordered Italy to pay her €18,400 in damages for the way she was treated during the brutal police interrogation. The violation of her rights had included not providing her with a lawyer or competent interpreter, the latter point being an important one, as Knox only had a very limited grasp of the language at the time and would have struggled to keep up with an Italian conversation if the interpreter wasn't up to scratch. Rafael Solicito didn't have as much joy with his claim for €500,000 in compensation for the Italian state for being falsely imprisoned for 4 years. Solicito and his family had spoken publicly about how they were in huge financial difficulty after having to pay legal fees over the years, which amounted to close to €500,000. However, this claim was rejected on the grounds that Solicito's own inconsistent statements to the police were a major contributing factor to his incarceration. But considering that Knox had won a payout after it was acknowledged that her human rights were violated during a harsh interrogation, it might seem a little surprising that she didn't have much luck with overturning her charge of slander against Patrick Lumumba, which was made under duress during the very same harsh interrogation. But she still did it. I don't know. A retrial of the case in June 2024 reconvicted Knox of slander, whilst a final appeal in January 2025 upheld this conviction. Bro, it's like 20 years later, what's going on? But a point of confusion here is that the slander charge in this retrial didn't actually relate to the original confession that she made during the interrogation. It related to the 4-page memo that she voluntarily composed the following day, in which she cast doubt over her earlier statements about Patrick. That might not seem to make much sense, but within the same memo, she vaguely describes having visions of seeing Patrick at the basketball courts on the night of the murder and linking this vision with Meredith's screams. And this was apparently enough for the Italian courts to deliver a guilty verdict for slander, as she had written the memo voluntarily after the interrogation, even though Knox's lawyers had argued that she was still very much under the lingering pressure of a flawed interview process. It seems a bit harsh to me in many ways. Yeah, it's harsh and complicated. At no point in the memo does Knox explicitly name Patrick as the killer. Instead, it's all fuzzily dressed up as something that might have happened in a dream. Yeah, that's kind of right, isn't it? Oh, God. This is real complicated. If anything, the main gist of the memo is to backtrack from her earlier statements in which she did heavily implicate Patrick. Even so, I suppose you have to see things from Patrick's point of view. He was arrested in the middle of the night in front of his terrified children and spent 2 weeks in prison, having never committed a crime in his life. Yeah. He says that he lost his reputation, his bar, and his house through no fault of his own, and he still hasn't received a cent in compensation or even an apology from Knox. Patrick felt that she plucked his name out of the air purely because he was black, which meant that the attention of the police was more likely to focus on him. That's probably not entirely fair, as it sounds as if the detectives in the interview room, who first dragged Patrick into the equation after misunderstanding a text conversation which included the words "see you later." But Patrick Lumumba also made a few interesting revelations, or at least allegations, around the time of retrial. He claimed that he'd been on the verge of firing Knox from Le Chic, as he was getting annoyed with her constant flirting, dancing with customers, and chatting to her mates instead of focusing on her work. He was considering replacing her with Meredith, who seemed to have a lot more commitment. He reckons that Knox was aware of this and wanted revenge on him. This was 20 years ago, dude. Come on, I know this was a big impact on your life, but... Eek. Patrick also felt that Knox was becoming increasingly jealous of Meredith, as the British student was stealing her thunder. He says that he got the impression that Knox was used to being the queen bee and the most popular woman in the room, and she was becoming increasingly jealous of Meredith, who seemed to be attracting far more attention with far more natural and quiet charm. We can't be sure how much all of this stems from Patrick's own anger against the woman who he says ruined his life, but he still seemed convinced that Knox was connected in some way with the murder. Meanwhile, the only person to have been officially convicted of the murder of Meredith Kercher had already been a free man for a few years by this point, although it's possible that he hasn't quite eaten his last prison meal. Rudy Guede was released on the 12th of November 2021, having served just 13 years of his sentence, which had originally been set at 30 before the fast-track reduction, the appeal reduction, and a final reduction of 3 years, which he had accumulated over time in good behavior credits. 13 years for a brutal murder like this? You shit me? He appeared to have been something of a model prisoner. He obtained a sociology degree, worked in the prison library, and towards the end of his sentence was allowed day releases to volunteer at a Catholic charity where he helped out at food banks and assisted the elderly. Following his release, Guede had apparently been approached for interviews but declined every invitation, expressing a desire to be forgotten by the world. Of course, not everyone's going to forget him, and not everyone was pleased with his early release from an already lenient sentence. The lawyer for Meredith's family suggested that the early release would only further renew the unspeakable suffering of the family. But the one member of the family who spoke publicly about it, Meredith's sister Stephanie, gave a surprisingly measured response, which I thought was quite remarkable under the circumstances. She told the Mirror, "It's a shock, obviously. I always knew the day would be coming at some point. It's not going to change anything for our family in the sense of Meredith. For what we've learned over the years, he has followed what he's been requested to do. I just hope that he has taken those right steps, and the justice system is right in its decision. It's not necessarily a decision I agree with, but as anyone in our situation would hope, a life sentence isn't a life sentence." I am surprised that she's so calm on this, and measured on this, but so keen on the others going to prison when this guy brutally murdered your sister. It was certainly a more calm and composed statement than anything put out by Knox or Solicito, both of whom angrily lashed out at Guido's refusal to take responsibility and clear their names. But despite the hopes of Stephanie, maybe the right decision hadn't been made after all. In February 2024, Guido was placed under special surveillance for 12 months following complaints of physical abuse from his former girlfriend. He had already been issued with a restraining order which banned him from being within 500 meters of the unnamed woman, and he had been required to wear an electronic bracelet at all times. By July 2025, Guido was back on trial, facing charges of sexual assault and violence against the same former girlfriend, who has given testimony on how she was forced into violent sexual acts and non-consensual encounters. "You're a piece of shit, my dude. You need to go back to prison forever." Guido denied the charges and admits that the relationship was conflictual, but claims it was always consensual. As always in Italy, the staggered trial is progressing very slowly, so it'll be a while before we get to a verdict. But whilst there's little doubt over Guido's involvement with Meredith's murder, is the jury still out on whether Knox and Solicito are definitively innocent? For a few dollars more. Well, a quick perusal of online forums will reveal that there seem to be thousands of armchair detectives who are utterly convinced that Amanda Knox must be guilty despite the final ruling. Okay, I wonder what you've got, or what I've missed, that goes to that conclusion. Not half as much is said about Rafael Solicito. It's Knox that attracts nearly all the venom. And this may partly be down to a widespread hatred of Knox, partly inspired by her odd behavior during the case, and partly inspired by what is considered to be a distasteful behavior in more recent years, a point we'll get to in just a moment. It's maybe worth bearing in mind that the Italian judges who found it credible that the pair were tied to the murder outnumber the two sets of judges who declared them innocent. This majority includes the judges at the original trial, the annulment of the acquittal, the retrial, along with the trials and appeals of Rudy Gade, who felt that the pair at least had a case to answer. There's certainly a whole raft of suspicious elements which are tricky to explain, but far from concrete proof of guilt. Yeah, it's just weird behavior, in my opinion. Persuade me otherwise, internet people. Knox insisted that her friendship with Meredith was perfectly healthy, but multiple sources claimed tensions were brewing between them. Meredith's father, John, had said that his daughter had been constantly complaining about the habits and lifestyle of her relatively new housemate, while Knox may have been angered if she learns that Meredith was being lined up to take her job at Le Chic. Fine. None of this leads to murder, necessarily. It's highly unlikely that it leads to murder. But student tiffs don't usually lead to vicious murder unless the perpetrator was consumed by mind-boggling levels of jealousy and rage, and the final text messages do seem to indicate that Knox and Meredith were still on very friendly terms, at least on the surface. Yeah, it's been suggested that the Italian police grew overly suspicious of Knox from the start because she didn't follow the Italian traditions of mourning for a friend, which usually involve large amounts of wailing and screeching at the sky, whereas a shocked Knox appeared to be strangely cold and indulging in some very odd behavior. I mean, they were friends, but relatively new friends, certainly not best friends. It's like if a friend of mine, a new friend who I'd known for a little while died, I'd be saddened, but I would be more shocked. Because I don't have that strong of an emotional attachment to them, and we are shocked by murders like this. And I think that's typically the reaction of someone who doesn't have an emotional attachment to the person. We can be saddened, but I would say that shocked would be more, is an understandable emotional response here. I'm defending us so hard, and I feel like I'm going to go get, this episode's going to be published, and 99% of the comments are going to be like, what the fuck? Simon, what the fuck? It's like, I know nothing about this. I'm waiting to be persuaded by the internet people. But that just seems to be a combination of culture clash and an unusual personality. The police also crossed the line in their aggressive questioning of Knox, which appears to be another case of the Reed technique spawning a false confession from a confused and distressed suspect. Switching off their phones so early on in the night of the murder was out of character, but it's feasible that they just didn't want to be disturbed, especially if Knox felt that she might get called into work if the bar got busier. Yep. I was more puzzled as to why on earth Knox would have claimed to have seen the body of Meredith when all the other witnesses confirmed that she never went into the bedroom after the body was discovered. I agree, that is weird, but she is, for lack of another word, a drama queen. And I think she wanted to say that she'd seen the body because it's more drama. Again, not enough for a murder conviction. Was this a slip-up on her part? And was she only able to give a description because she'd already seen the body long before the police arrived? Well, it's a theory, but I kind of doubt it. Whilst she may have been in a state of disorientation at the time, I also suspect that her alleged constant craving of attention might actually have played a part in this. Yep, Danny and I, same page. The first thing she wrote in her notebook, whilst waiting down at the police station, was how she had been the first to find her flatmate dead. And I think it's possible that she just needed to have played the most important role in the story. She just didn't want to be the one who was first on the scene in the apartment and didn't really do anything, or the one who hung back after the bedroom door was barged down. That wasn't good enough. She wanted to be first to find her flatmate dead. Oh, and she wanted to write a song about it. Yes, innocent, I believe Amanda Knox may be. Tasteful, Amanda Knox is certainly not. One of the elements that's harder to rationalize is why Solicito changed his statement quite so drastically so early on and destroyed the alibi for his own girlfriend. Could he really have been so completely off his box that he couldn't remember what he was doing on the night that his girlfriend's mate was murdered? Yeah, I think people can be that high. I've never been that high, but I believe it can happen. I suppose he could have fallen into a snooze during the later hours and genuinely didn't know if Knox stayed with him, in which case he was obviously now suspicious of her, prompting him to change his statement. The suspicion may have been mutual, as it's interesting how Knox took the time to slyly note that her boyfriend had blood on his hands, which she assumed was from the fish he was cooking. Also, he was cooking a fish at like 11 at night. What's up with that? Of course, it could just be that both of them were terrified of being found guilty of a crime they didn't commit on a night when they were both stoned, and they both started focusing on covering their own backs. Whilst many have convinced themselves that the pair are guilty, one other theory is that they weren't directly involved, but they knew more than they were letting on. Could it be that they knew and even facilitated Guide's visit to the apartment by lending him Knox's key, perhaps under the impression that he wasn't going to go so far as to kill her? Okay, we know that a break-in was staged and that Guide must have arrived through the front door. Meredith's father seems adamant that there's no way Meredith knew Guide well enough to let him in, so the implication is that he must have had a helping hand in the form of a front door key. Quite a lot of this speculation rewinds back to the evidence, which suggested that Guide can't have acted alone and that Knox and Solicito are the most likely accomplices, as they are the ones most likely to have gotten Guide into the cottage. I'm not so sure, though. For starters, it's not unfeasible that Guide had somehow managed to convince Meredith to let him in under false pretenses, perhaps just to make a quick phone call or whatever. While she didn't know him well, she would have recognized him as one of the friends of the Italian men downstairs, and may not have considered him a threat. Yeah, it could be one of those situations where it'd be weird not to let him in. It's like, no, I'm mates with, Guillermo downstairs, or whatever the Italian dude's name was. It's like, can I just use the phone real quick? My mobile's out. If you said, no, you can't come in, it'd be really weird. Because assuming if it was completely innocent, which obviously we know it's not, but if it was, the Italian guys would be like, dude, why did you let him in to answer the phone? What's up with that? And it'd be weird. So yeah, I totally believe he could be let in under false pretenses. Alternatively, he could have just knocked on the door and then barged straight in uninvited when the door was opened. Did he not have a peephole? But another point is this presumption that more than one assailant must have been involved. Not everyone agreed with this idea that Meredith must have put up a strong fight because she had an orange belt in karate. I'm fairly sure orange is quite low down, no? Or the idea that others must have been involved because she had multiple cuts all across her body, while Guide just had a small cut on his hand. Guide was a strong, athletic guy, whilst Meredith was a slim and slender young woman, and I'm not convinced that an orange belt, I mean the second belt in karate after the beginner white belt, oh, there we go, would have done much good in this case. The fact that Guide only had a small cut on his hand might more be an indication that she couldn't put up much of a fight at all whilst he was inflicting multiple wounds on her body. Yeah. The defense teams for Knox and Solicito had both always argued that the wounds were more consistent with a sole attacker. Even the forensic specialist, Dr. Luca Lally, who was a witness for the prosecution in the original trial, gave testimony in which he expressed his belief that there were multiple attackers, admitted under cross-examination that he could not rule out the possibility of a lone attacker. Besides which, if Guide only had a single cut on his hand, shouldn't Knox and Solicito also have had cuts and scratches, if we're going by this logic? If either of them had borne visible wounds straight after the murder, then I can see why they would be obvious suspects, but neither of them had a single mark on their bodies, which surely suggests they were never recently involved in a physical struggle. So, we can only rewind back to the genuine hard evidence, or in their case, the distinct lack of it. Whereas Guide's traces were all over the crime scene, as you would expect, there was nothing at all to be found belonging to Knox or Solicito. And the isolated DNA evidence which helped to twice convict them, consisting of a bra clasp which had been moved around for 7 weeks and a random knife which didn't match the outline of the knife found in the bedroom, was later found to be unreliable and likely contaminated. It's not out of the question. There are parts of this story that we'll never fully understand. Maybe Knox and Solicito were up to something else very dodgy that night and they were trying to cover up, which explains some of their bizarre behavior. But it really doesn't look as if they were connected in any way with the murder of Meredith Kercher. Even so, that won't stop people hating Amanda Knox. And you can sometimes see their point. Yeah, I can. But if you're hating her because she murdered someone, I think that's incorrect. Now describing herself as a writer, producer, journalist, public speaker, advocate for criminal reform, and most recently of all, wait for it, a comedian, Knox has certainly kept herself busy since her release from prison. And she's made some pretty surprising decisions in recent years. Back in 2022, she returned to Perugia to meet up for a chat with her old mate, the prosecutor, Mignini, who spent years trying to convince everyone that she was a devil-worshipping murderer. Oh my god, I would never go back to Italy if this was me. I mean, like, fuck this, I'm so out. She was apparently keen to try and understand the mindset of this man, and she even claims that they've since struck up something close to a friendship. It sounds as if the real purpose of the meeting was to try and get him to admit that he might have been wrong, but she was probably a bit disappointed by the outcome. Mignini told The Telegraph that he believes Knox has changed and now has a good opinion of her, but he still believes that she was present when Meredith was murdered, and he doesn't feel that there was justice for Meredith. Still, it sounds like he'll always be free for a catch-up and a frothy coffee if Knox is paying. Knox, who is now married with 2 children, also had a brief reunion with her old flame, Rafael Solicito, who is now a computer engineer working in Milan. Solicito has been relatively quiet after his book sank without trace, and he said he found it difficult to find a good job because potential employers often went off the idea when they delved into his history. During the reunion, the pair visited the medieval town of Gubbio to go truffle hunting. Apparently, this is exactly what they planned to do on the day that Meredith's body was found, and they were now finally getting around to it 15 years later. I can imagine that some of the conversation might have been a bit awkward, but I hope the truffles were good. The uneasy thing about all of this is that both meetings came across as little more than publicity stunts. Yeah, what else would they be? And Knox is often accused of carving a high-profile career out of the death of her friend. She spends a lot of time in the limelight and seems to enjoy it. It's true that she often devotes time to raising awareness of wrongful conviction and the need for criminal justice reform, but crikey does she get around a bit. She wrote another book which focused on her release from prison and to return to something approaching a normal life. She hosts podcasts, live streams, and has a strong following on social media. She was the executive producer of an 8-part dramatization of her story on Netflix called The Twisted Tale of Amanda Knox in 2025. This was followed up with a documentary on Hulu in 2026 entitled Mouth of the Wolf, Amanda Knox Returns to Italy, which appears to have been the primary reason that she met up with her old prosecutor again. It was a good idea for a TV project. Yeah, it's PR. Right? Obviously. Maybe you can't blame her in a way. I can imagine I'd feel a bit annoyed if I'd spent 4 years of my life in prison and then spent another 8 years pleading my innocence. Why not take the opportunity to whinge about your ordeal from the rooftops and perhaps even make a bit of money out of some books and TV shows? But it does feel a bit like she's desperately hogging the limelight in this case, and that everything has to be about Amanda Knox. Relatively few people talk about Meredith Kercher, or even remember her name. There's not a lot to talk about Solicito either, even though he went through a similar ordeal, albeit a bit under the radar. Yeah, it also seems like he's choosing to stay under the radar. Not many people talk about Rudy Gade, the man who actually killed Meredith. Instead, all the attention is on the woman who didn't kill Meredith Kercher, and it feels like she's been milking it a bit too much for comfort. Knox herself acknowledges that Meredith has been forgotten in all of this. When Guido was released early, she recalls her disgust over how the New York Post went with the headline, "Man who killed Amanda Knox's roommate freed." Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, I would be too. That's fucking tasteful. But it is the Post. No space for the name of the victim or the murderer, just Amanda Knox. As she once told The Guardian, Meredith became the footnote to a story where I was the central figure. But then it's not like she makes much of an effort to redress the balance when she has the opportunity. The 2026 Hulu documentary is all about Knox. The earlier 2025 Netflix dramatization on which she served as executive producer is told entirely from her perspective, and very little attention is given to the character or the backstory of Meredith. It also suffers from a cheesy and perhaps disingenuous ending. Back during the original trial, Knox was asked if she had endured suffering and trauma from the death of her good friend. Knox replied that she was shocked, but followed this up by pointing out that she'd only known Meredith for about a month, it was actually 6 weeks, and that she was now trying to move on with her life. I don't want to be a dick, and maybe I'm a dick. Wow. I just had this whole thing earlier where I was saying like, oh yeah, I mean, it would shock me more than it would upset me. I mean, of course I'd be upset, but shock would be the primary thing. And oh my God, do I have the same opinion as her? And she seems very distasteful. Oh, I don't like that I said that now. But also, it's not untrue. At least, from my perspective. Oof, complicated stuff. And that's probably a fair point. Oh, good, Daddy agrees with me. Sometimes I wonder, you know. Of course, you're going to be shocked to find out your housemate was murdered in your apartment, but it's not like these two were cherished childhood friends. They were students sharing a house who didn't always get along by the sounds of it. Getting accused of Meredith's murder shortly afterwards probably put a very different slant on her death. Considering everything that happened afterwards, you could hardly blame Knox for wishing that she'd never met Meredith. Yet, the 2025 dramatization concludes with a syrupy monologue from the character of Knox who laments never having had the chance to mourn her friend and declaring that she's now ready to mourn both of us. Ugh, it's cringe. It's so cringe. Not only does it sound wholly unconvincing, but it seems to be using the name of Meredith for a sentimental closure, which still manages to push Knox center stage as a fellow victim. Different levels of victimhood right there, Knox. It's perhaps not too surprising that the Kercher family didn't want anything to do with the Netflix series. Meredith's sister Stephanie told The Guardian, "Our family has been through so much, and it's difficult to understand how this serves any purpose." Oh, I'll tell you the purpose. Dollar bills, y'all! The family had similar thoughts about the 2026 Hulu documentary, with their lawyer telling the Daily Mail that they felt Knox was cashing in for the umpteenth time. In fact, the Kercher family have regularly vented their disapproval of Knox's activity via their lawyer Francesco Maresca. Here's a small sample from some of the many statements that he made on behalf of the family over the years. This continuous stirring is a demonstration of a lack of sensitivity. She earns money and obtains visibility on the television after many years. It seems that Knox does not want people to forget about this story and does all she can to keep it alive. It's evident that for Knox, the Perugia trial continues to be a source of income and a series of opportunities to maintain her name in the media. Every time she speaks, she reopens the tragedy of what happened to Meredith nearly 20 years ago, and it really hurts the family. If Knox keeps insisting so much that she and Meredith were friends, why doesn't she respect her memory and keep it quiet? Perhaps sensitivity has always been a difficult concept for Amanda Knox. Yeah, I would say so. She says she has repeatedly reached out to the Kercher family to meet up for a reconciliation, to the point where the family's lawyer urged her to learn how to take a hint, as the answer will always be no. Critics have suggested that a better idea would have been to offer to donate some or all of the profits from the books to the Kercher family, although I doubt they would have accepted. In her own defense, Knox has stated that honoring the past of Meredith shouldn't mean erasing her own history, and suggested that she shouldn't be forced to shut up and disappear just because her visible presence makes some people feel uncomfortable. That might be missing the point a little bit, though. I don't think anyone would have had too much of a major problem if Knox had pursued a high-profile career that had nothing to do with the murder of Meredith. Some might still have accused her of using her involvement in a tragic case as a launchpad to stardom, but it's not like she should be banned from forging her preferred career. In that sense, she's right when she says that she shouldn't just be expected to shut up and disappear. And as I touched on earlier, it's only right that she has a chance to have her say after having been wrongly imprisoned for 4 years. It wouldn't be fair to deny her a chance to speak just because her story also involves somebody else's death. But I think the issue is the sheer relentlessness of it. She's already had her say in multiple profitable ventures that occasionally purport to be about Meredith, but aren't really about Meredith at all. She will just not let it go, and you can see why the Kercher family gets upset, as it feels like Meredith is still constantly getting dragged into Knox's next opportunity for self-publicity. Yep, agree with that too. It gets worse. Oh God. It was recently announced that Amanda Knox will be premiering her new stand-up comedy show in August 2026 at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, the largest arts festival in the world, which has been running since 1947, and this year will feature over 3,600 shows across 25 days. When I first heard about this, I wondered if it might actually be a positive thing. Maybe she was finally moving on to entirely fresh territory, which has nothing to do with the case of a murdered housemate. Oh, please don't tell me that this is part of her routine. There is distastefulness, which I feel Amanda Knox does have in spades. And then there is distastefulness, which would be that. The title of Knox's new one-hour comedy show is Cartwheel, namely presumably after the cartwheel that she still denies performing down at the police station. And while we don't have full details of the show yet, the opening lines of the blurb reveal Amanda Knox is approaching 40, juggling motherhood and facing an existential crisis. What if she peaked at wrongful imprisonment? How is she going to explain it all to her daughter, who's already asking to hear the story of Mama Goes to Italy? Apparently it's for grown-ups only, and it contains strong language and scenes of a sexual nature. Understandably, the very idea has come under heavy fire from critics, including Francesco Maresca, the now clearly exasperated lawyer for the Kercher family, who ranted, "Enough is enough. The show is offensive, deplorable, and an insult to Meredith's memory. I have lost all hope that Knox can comprehend the feelings her behavior has provoked among the victim's loved ones." Yep. In response to the fury, Knox has claimed that she has something legitimate to say, and she won't be silenced by the bullies. Knox doesn't strike me as the kind of person with natural funny bones, but it'll be interesting to see how this laugh-a-thon goes down with the Edinburgh Fringe crowd. I expect it'll go down like lead shit. Still, despite all the controversy, at least it now looks as if we finally got this case wrapped up once and for all. Danny, there are still 3 pages. But wait, there's more. Well, this is not a game-changing development and might not lead anywhere, but it still might be a development of sorts, at least according to the Satan-obsessed prosecutor Giuliano Mignini. In October 2025, he revealed to the Italian newspaper La Stampa that he had received the name of a new person of interest from a reliable local source which he believes may shed new light on the case. We don't have too many details yet, but Mignini is very interested in tracking down a certain Bulgarian individual who happened to be in Perugia at the time of the murder, but reportedly fled Italy shortly afterwards. He stressed that this person may be a crucial witness rather than a suspect. It's a name that he'd never considered before, but one that he thinks could be crucial to the whole case. The now-retired Mignini says that the Perugia prosecutor's office is dealing with the matter, but it's not yet known if the investigation will be reopened. The story of the never-ending death of Meredith Kercher may not quite be over yet. But sadly, if there are any new developments, neither of Meredith's parents will have lived to see them. 77-year-old John Kercher was found lying on a road in a bad state near his home in Croydon in early 2020. He had a head injury and fractures to his arms, legs, and ribs, but no memory of what had happened to him. It seems likely that he was the victim of a hit and run, but this was never confirmed. He died in the hospital 3 weeks later. Oh, God. Just 4 months later, his ex-wife, 74-year-old Arlene, died of pneumonia in a hospital during the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Whilst they had both witnessed the final acquittal of Knox and Solicito, neither of them had lived to see the release of Rudy Gady or the later prolific works of Amanda Knox. This is probably for the best. And neither of them believed that the death of their daughter had ever been fully resolved during the final bewildering 13 years of their lives, which had involved a slapdash police investigation, a false confession squeezed from a dubious interrogation method, fingers pointing in the wrong direction, conflicting expert testimony, contaminated evidence, and a whole string of trials in which the judges couldn't really make up their minds about who they were supposed to be listening to. It may have worked out for the best if Meredith's family had been so forcefully led down a line of thinking that Gide couldn't have acted alone. I think there's a very good chance that justice for Meredith was fully served as early as 2009, but then the case was dragged through a decade's worth of futile detours, which led exactly nowhere and only prolonged their suffering. As we said at the beginning, it's sadly inevitable that the murder victim is rarely discussed or remembered in the same way as the murderer or other individuals in the case. The harsh truth is that most murder victims are just decent, everyday people, and it's only when their lives are cut brutally short that the true crime story begins. This case is a particularly extreme example. If you type the name Meredith Kercher into a Google image search, you might be surprised to see just how many photographs of Amanda Knox get pulled up. So it seems more than fitting to save the final words for Meredith. She was posthumously awarded her degree from the University of Leeds, which was collected by her sister Stephanie in 2009. But her name also lives on in the Foreigners' University in Perugia. 5 years after her death, the university entered a collaboration with the city of Perugia and the Italian embassy in London to launch the Meredith Kercher Scholarship Fund. This offers funding to British students who wish to study Italian language and art courses at the prestigious university. The mayor of Perugia declared that this had been an opportunity for the city to honour the memory of Meredith, while Stephanie Kercher felt that it was a perfect gesture for her sister, which would help bring back positive associations with Perugia. 8 years before her death, John Kercher wrote a book called Meredith, Our Daughter's Murder and the Heartbreaking Quest for the Truth, which fell short of becoming a bestseller, but was warmly received by critics and the relatively small audience of readers. There's an important difference here, compared to the other books written about the case. This one wasn't written for profit. All the proceeds went to a charitable foundation which the family had set up in her name. Perhaps we should leave the very last words to Meredith's siblings. Stephanie paid the following tribute to her sister. It's no exaggeration to say that Meredith touched the lives of everyone she met with her infectious upbeat personality, smile, and sense of humour. Nothing was ever too much effort for her. As anyone who had been lucky enough to have known her would testify, she was one of the most beautiful, intelligent, witty, and caring people you could wish to meet. Meredith's brother John makes a final uplifting point about the life of Meredith Kercher rather than the death. Everyone associates her with a tragic event. We would prefer not to think of her in that way. We prefer to concentrate on the 21 years that we did have with her. Thank you for watching.